Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very quiet journey back in time. You're going to find yourself gently drifting, not into a fairy tale, but into the surprisingly stark realities of medieval life, specifically when it comes to that most elusive of human emotions: love. Forget everything you think you know from Disney movies, from those sweeping historical romances, from every single Renaissance fair you've ever imagined. Tonight, you're going to feel the cold, damp stone of a castle, smell the wood smoke and the unwashed masses, and realize that your chances of a happily ever after with a dashing knight or a demure princess would be, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't survive the first winter, let alone find a soulmate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes, and instantly, you're not in your cozy bed anymore. Instead, you find yourself trudging through mud, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, with smoke and something vaguely animal. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes, a stark contrast to the gentle hum of your modern life. You look up, and there it is, a towering castle, its stone walls weathered by centuries, not sparkling white like in the movies, but a drab, functional gray. This is the real medieval world, and your modern notions of romance are about to get a rather rude though gentle awakening. We've all been conditioned, haven't we? From childhood, we're fed a steady diet of valiant knights in shining armor, rescuing fair maidens from dragons and wicked sorcerers. You picture sweeping ballrooms, whispered declarations of undying love under a moonlit sky, and the inevitable true love's kiss that breaks any curse. You imagine a world where chivalry was a knight's highest virtue, always extended to the delicate hand of a lady, and where marriage was the culmination of a passionate, soul-stirring romance. It's a beautiful, comforting fantasy, a soft blanket woven from centuries of artistic embellishment and deliberate historical revisionism. But as you shiver slightly in this imagined medieval air, you begin to suspect that reality was a little less enchanted. The most shocking truth you're about to uncover is that our modern understanding of love itself, particularly romantic love, simply didn't exist in the same way for most people in the medieval period. When you think of love today, you often think of personal affection, emotional connection, shared interests, and mutual attraction as the bedrock of a relationship. You dream of finding your soulmate, someone who completes you, someone with whom you can share your deepest thoughts and dreams. Now, imagine a world where survival was the primary objective of every single day. A world where disease could wipe out half your family in a single season, where famine was a constant threat, and where violent conflict was never far from your doorstep. In such a world, the luxury of seeking a soulmate was almost unimaginable for the vast majority of people. Your modern perspective, steeped in centuries of Enlightenment thought, individualism, and romantic literature, makes it incredibly difficult to truly grasp the medieval mindset. They weren't just people who wore funny clothes and spoke differently. They operated under an entirely different set of social, economic, and spiritual parameters. For them, life was a collective endeavor, deeply rooted in family, community, and the church. Personal desires, particularly in matters of the heart, were often secondary, if they were considered at all, to the needs of the larger unit. It's almost like comparing the decision-making process for choosing a life partner today to how you might select a business partner for a highly critical long-term venture. One is about emotional fulfillment. The other is about practical success and stability. There was no swiping right on a duke you'd never met, alas. Consider the pervasive myth of the knight and his chivalry. You see him, perhaps, in gleaming armor, kneeling before a lady, offering her a rose or a heartfelt poem. The reality, however, was often far more brutal and pragmatic. While codes of chivalry did exist, they were primarily a code of conduct for warriors, designed to regulate behavior on the battlefield, promote loyalty among vassals, and perhaps instill a semblance of Christian morality in a violent profession. A knight's primary duties were to his lord, his fealty, and his martial prowess. His chivalry was often directed more towards fellow knights, especially in tournaments, or his superiors, rather than some abstract notion of protecting all women. When you imagine the heavy, clanking armor, the sweat, the grime, and the very real danger of a joust or a pitched battle, the image of a delicate, poetic lover starts to dissipate. A knight was a killing machine, trained from a young age in warfare, and his gentle side was often reserved for specific, ritualized circumstances, not the everyday reality of romantic pursuit. And what of the princess you envision, locked away in a tower, waiting for her prince? In the medieval period, a princess, or any noblewoman for that matter, was a valuable asset, a living chess piece in the grand game of power and politics. Her identity was inextricably linked to her lineage, her family's wealth, and her ability to forge strategic alliances through marriage. Her biggest dilemma wasn't choosing between two charming princes, but between two strategically advantageous dukedoms, one perhaps with slightly less swampy land. Her value was often measured in the dowry she brought, the lands she represented, and most critically, her capacity to produce healthy male heirs to continue the family line. Personal attraction or affection was, at best, a fortunate bonus, and at worst, completely irrelevant. You can almost hear the rustle of parchment as marriage contracts were drawn up, long before any potential bride and groom ever laid eyes on each other. The idea of happily ever after itself is a distinctly modern construct. For most medieval people, happily ever after meant surviving the winter, avoiding the plague, and having enough food to feed your family. Life was short, often brutal, and constantly uncertain. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, diseases like dysentery and smallpox were rampant, and famine was a recurring nightmare. The concept of a long, blissful marriage based purely on emotional fulfillment was a luxury few could afford to even contemplate, let alone achieve. You feel the chill of the drafty castle, the dampness seeping into your bones, and you realize that comfort and security, not passionate romance, were the true aspirations for many. Now, you might be thinking, but what about all those romantic stories? What about King Arthur and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde? Ah yes, the stories. This is where the lines blur, and where our modern myths truly took root. Medieval literature, particularly the genre of courtly love, did idealize a particular kind of romantic affection. Troubadours sang of unattainable ladies, of knights performing valiant deeds for their beloved, of passionate, often illicit, love. But here's the crucial point. These were often literary constructs, idealized fantasies created for the amusement and escapism of the elite, not reflections of everyday reality. They were often about the quest for love, the suffering of love, or the transgression of love, highlighting its dangerous, all-consuming nature. In fact, a quirky tidbit you might find surprising is that in some medieval medical and philosophical texts, intense romantic love was often viewed as a form of illness, a kind of madness or melancholia that could literally make you sick. It wasn't always seen as a purely positive, life-affirming force as we largely perceive it today. This lovesickness could manifest in physical symptoms like fever, loss of appetite, or sleeplessness, and it was something that might even require a cure. So, less roses are red, violets are blue, and more your family's lands are vast, and your father's treasury is true, with a side of potential emotional contagion. This perspective highlights just how differently medieval people conceptualized intense emotional attachments compared to our modern romantic ideals. The very concept of individual happiness and personal fulfillment through romantic partnership is, in many ways, a relatively recent invention, blossoming more fully in the Enlightenment and the Romantic era. Medieval society was hierarchical, communal, and deeply religious. Your identity was largely defined by your family, your status, and your duties. The idea that you, as an individual, had the right to choose your life partner based purely on personal affection was simply not part of the prevailing worldview for most social strata. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced romantic love as a distinct emotion, or if it was inextricably intertwined with duty, piety, and social standing. It's a fascinating debate, highlighting the challenge of applying modern psychological frameworks to historical experiences. As you continue to absorb these realities, you begin to understand that the love you've been taught to expect from the medieval period is almost entirely a projection of your own modern sensibilities. It's a beautiful lens, certainly, but one that distorts the true, often grittier picture. To truly understand love in the Middle Ages, you need to strip away those comforting layers of myth and fairy tale and prepare to confront a world where love was often practical, sometimes brutal, occasionally passionate, but always profoundly different from the idealized version we hold so dear today. And as you step further into this historical landscape, you'll discover the shocking truths that truly shaped human relationships in a time long past. So, you've probably pictured medieval love as something out of a storybook, haven't you? Knights in shining armor, fair maidens, passionate declarations under a moonlit sky, all leading to a grand, romantic wedding where two souls, deeply in love, pledge their lives to each other. You might even imagine the gentle flutter of butterflies in the stomach of a young noblewoman as she gazes upon her betrothed, a man she's chosen, a man who makes her heart sing. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? A cozy, comforting image to drift off to. But let's gently peel back that silken curtain, shall we? Because the truth, my dear listener, is a little less sparkly. In fact, it's often as practical and unromantic as a tax ledger. Forget the butterflies. Medieval marriage was primarily a strategic economic and political arrangement. It was less about finding your soulmate and more about finding someone who could bring a really good set of pastures or a critical stretch of coastline to the table. You see, the medieval world was a harsh, uncertain place, and survival often depended on shrewd alliances, not on whether your eyes met across a crowded banquet hall and sparks flew. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a powerful lord, or perhaps a shrewd lady managing a vast estate. Your primary concern isn't the emotional well-being of your children when it comes to their future unions. Oh no, it's about the land. Always the land. Land was power, wealth, and security. And what better way to expand your holdings, consolidate your influence, or secure your borders than through a carefully orchestrated marriage? You're not just marrying off your daughter. You're acquiring new territory, settling a long-standing dispute, or forging a crucial military alliance. It's less a love story and more a corporate merger, only with more elaborate headwear and significantly higher stakes if the deal falls through. Think of it this way. Your family's entire future, its status, its very survival, hinges on these marital negotiations. You sit in a dimly lit hall, perhaps the scent of stale ale and wood smoke clinging to the tapestries, as emissaries from another noble house haggle over the details. They're discussing dowries, the wealth, land, or goods that the bride's family brings to the marriage. This isn't pocket money. This is often a substantial transfer of assets, sometimes so significant it could bankrupt a less fortunate family. The dowry was the bride's contribution to the new household, a form of early inheritance, but it also served as a crucial bargaining chip. Without a sufficient dowry, a daughter, even of noble birth, might find herself with very limited prospects, destined perhaps for a convent rather than a marital bed. It's a bit like trying to buy a house today without a down payment. You simply wouldn't get very far. And then there's the dower, which is often confused with the dowry, but it's quite different. The dower was the portion of the husband's estate that was legally set aside for his wife's support should she become a widow. It was her security, her guaranteed income, ensuring she wouldn't be left destitute. So, while the dowry flowed from the bride's family, the dower was a provision from the groom's. These weren't romantic gestures. They were legal safeguards, meticulously detailed in contracts that read more like property deeds than declarations of affection. You can almost hear the quill scratching on parchment, the dry rustle of documents, as every single cow, every last acre, is accounted for. These unions were not about personal preference. They were about lineage and legacy. You, as a young man or woman, were a valuable commodity, a pawn in a much larger game. Your feelings? Frankly, they were largely irrelevant. You might meet your future spouse for the very first time on your wedding day, or perhaps only a few days before. Imagine that first awkward encounter. Two strangers, perhaps barely out of childhood, standing before an altar, knowing that their entire lives and the future of their respective families are now irrevocably intertwined. No getting to know you dinners, no awkward first dates, just poof, you're married. It's enough to make you grateful for the invention of dating apps, isn't it? Even if they sometimes feel like a medieval market for spouses, at least you get to swipe left. The political motivations were equally, if not more, potent, especially at the highest echelons of society. Royal marriages were the ultimate geopolitical chess moves. A marriage between a prince and a princess could solidify a peace treaty that had ended decades of bloody conflict, or it could forge an alliance strong enough to deter a common enemy. You're not just choosing a partner, you're choosing a foreign policy. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages, is a mainstream historical fact that perfectly illustrates this. Her first marriage to King Louis VII of France was a union of two vast territories, but their lack of a male heir and their personal incompatibilities led to an annulment. Her second marriage, famously, was to Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. This union brought her vast Aquitanian lands under English control, transforming the geopolitical landscape of Western Europe overnight. It wasn't about love. It was about power, land, and heirs. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from the royal advisors when such a strategic match was finally sealed, probably followed by a collective groan about the inevitable future squabbles over who gets to keep the duchy. Sometimes, these political marriages were designed to avert war entirely. You could prevent countless deaths and save untold resources by simply marrying off a son or a daughter to the rival family's offspring. It was a form of medieval diplomacy, only instead of signed agreements, you got a new relative who might also happen to bring a castle or two. It's the ultimate make love, not war scenario, but with the emphasis firmly on the make and very little on the love. Even the Church, despite its growing influence over the sacrament of marriage, largely supported these pragmatic unions. While it preached that marriage should be consensual and indissoluble, the reality on the ground was often different. The consent of the bride, particularly, was frequently a formality, given under immense family pressure. To refuse a prearranged match could mean dishonoring your family, jeopardizing their status, or even facing severe punishment. It was a choice between I do and I do not wish to be disowned and possibly exiled. Some choice, right? And speaking of consent, here's a quirky tidbit for you. While the Church eventually settled on a minimum age for marriage, around 12 for girls, 14 for boys, betrothals could occur much earlier. You might be promised to a future spouse as an infant, or even before you were born, the agreement sealed by a handshake between two powerful fathers. Imagine being told at the ripe old age of 5, "Darling, you're going to marry Lord so-and-so's son when you're older. He's currently 3 and quite good at drooling." Your entire future was mapped out before you could even tie your own shoes. These child betrothals often involved a sponsalia, a formal promise to marry, which was almost as binding as the marriage itself, though the actual ceremony would be delayed until the parties reached the age of consent. Truly makes you appreciate the freedom to choose your own destiny, doesn't it? The societal pressure to marry well, meaning to marry strategically, was immense. For a noble family, a bad marriage could lead to financial ruin, loss of prestige, or even a decline into obscurity. For a woman, marriage was often her only path to social standing and economic security. Her identity became inextricably linked to her husband's. She moved from her father's household to her husband's, her primary purpose to bear heirs and manage the domestic sphere, often a significant undertaking for a large estate. Historians still argue whether the concept of consent, as understood by the Church, truly offered any meaningful autonomy to the individuals involved, particularly women, given the intense family pressure and economic stakes. Was it truly consent if the alternative meant social ruin or a life of poverty? It's a fascinating debate, one that highlights the complex interplay between religious doctrine, social custom, and individual agency in the medieval period. So, as you can see, the medieval marriage was a far cry from the romantic ideal we often entertain today. It was a bedrock of society, a complex web of alliances, property transfers, and power plays, meticulously arranged for the benefit of families, lineages, and kingdoms. Love, if it emerged at all, was a fortunate byproduct, a quiet ember that might, perhaps, spark to life years into the union, rather than the initial blazing inferno. You were a piece on a chessboard, and your move was decided long before you even knew the rules of the game. You've just wrapped your head around the idea that medieval marriage wasn't exactly a rom-com, right? It was less meet-cute and more meat-contract. But why? Why this almost ruthless practicality that seems to strip away every romantic notion you've ever held? Well, if you imagine yourself as a medieval lord or lady, perhaps gazing out from your drafty, yet imposing castle, you quickly realize your entire world isn't built on fluffy clouds and whispered sweet nothings. Oh no, it's built on, well, stuff. Tangible, heavy, often muddy stuff. Land, titles, power, and, crucially, the people who will inherit it all. See, for medieval nobility, your family wasn't just your nearest and dearest. It was your brand, your legacy, your entire social security system, if you will, but with significantly higher stakes. The preservation of your lineage, your bloodline, as they so grandly put it, was paramount. You weren't just marrying a person. You were marrying into a family, linking two dynastic chains together in a strategic maneuver that could elevate or utterly destroy your house. It was less a wedding and more a corporate merger, but with more heraldry and significantly less HR. Property, glorious property, was the bedrock of medieval power. Land meant wealth, it meant the ability to raise knights, it meant peasants to work the fields, and it meant influence over vast swathes of territory. And land, dear listener, needed to stay in the family, or even better, expand. So, when you're orchestrating a marriage for your son or daughter, you're not thinking about shared hobbies or a charming smile. You're thinking about acres. You're thinking about strategic locations on trade routes or defensible borders. You're thinking about the size of the dowry coming in, or the valuable parcels of land you might gain through a smart union. It's a complex, high-stakes game of medieval monopoly, but the stakes are your entire existence, and there are no get-out-of-jail-free cards if you make a bad deal. You just lose your castle, or your head sometimes if the political winds shift unfavorably. And who keeps this grand, intricate game going? Heirs, preferably male heirs. The pressure, oh the pressure, to produce a robust son was immense. In many regions, particularly among the nobility primogeniture, the system where the eldest son inherits everything, was the dominant practice for noble families. This was designed, quite explicitly, to prevent the fragmentation of estates, which could fatally weaken a family's power base. Imagine trying to run a powerful duchy if it's been carved up among 5 sons, each with a tiny, less significant holding. But if one son gets it all, the power stays consolidated, the family name remains strong, and the legacy endures. This is a mainstream historical fact that underpinned so much of medieval marital strategy. It wasn't about fairness or even familial affection. It was about power, survival, and the continuation of the family's standing. If you were a noblewoman, your primary, almost singular purpose in marriage was to bear children, and ideally a healthy, living son. If you didn't, well, your position could become precarious. Very precarious indeed. What if you only produced daughters? Well, daughters could be married off to bring in new alliances and dowries, serving as valuable assets in their own right, but they typically couldn't inherit the main title or the bulk of the land in their own name, at least not in the same direct way a son could. This is where things got really tense. A lord without a male heir faced the terrifying prospect of his line dying out, his lands being absorbed by another family, or even worse, falling back into the hands of the crown. It was a potential existential crisis for the entire family brand. You can practically hear the collective sigh of relief every time a son was born, followed by a frantic check for all 10 fingers and toes, and probably a quick prayer that he wouldn't turn out to be, a poet. So where do the actual people, the bride and groom, fit into this grand scheme? Often they didn't. They were pieces on a chessboard, moved by their parents or guardians to secure the family's future. You might be betrothed as a child, your future sealed before you even understood what marriage meant, or had any say in the matter. Your feelings? Your aspirations? Those were charming little novelties, perhaps, but entirely irrelevant to the serious business of securing lineage and property. It was a stark reality that stripped away any illusion of personal choice. You were born into a role, and your marriage was perhaps the most significant act you would perform for your family, whether you liked it or not. Imagine having your entire life path, including your partner, decided for you based purely on land deeds and family trees. It's a bit like being told your future spouse is chosen by an algorithm designed solely for maximum profit, not personal happiness. And medieval algorithms were far less sophisticated, let me tell you. Speaking of inheritances and the desperate need for heirs, you sometimes find fascinating, almost bizarre, clauses in medieval wills and marriage contracts designed to ensure continuity. For instance, there are records of specific provisions for a child of the body, meaning a direct descendant, often with severe penalties or forfeiture of land if the line failed. In some particularly elaborate cases, noble families would even arrange for the adoption of a distant relative or an approved heir if the direct line seemed to be failing, a sort of medieval plan B for succession, though this was rare and often fiercely contested. One quirky tidbit illustrates just how far they'd go. There's a fascinating, if somewhat obscure, historical account from 12th century England concerning a bitter dispute over land. A woman claimed her deceased husband had been incapable of producing an heir, and therefore the land should revert to her family rather than his distant relatives. The court, in its infinite wisdom, actually had to convene a panel of matrons to physically examine the husband's body, post-mortem mind you, to determine if his deficiency was indeed the cause. Talk about an awkward probate hearing. It just goes to show the almost absurd lengths they'd go to determine who got the land, and how deeply intertwined fertility and property were. Now, while this paints a rather bleak picture of arranged marriages devoid of personal feeling, it's worth pausing to consider the nuances. Historians still argue whether genuine affection could truly blossom within these pragmatically arranged unions, or if the emotional landscape of medieval marriage was entirely defined by duty and obligation. Some scholars suggest that over time, a quiet companionship, even a deep respect, might develop, especially if the couple found common ground in managing their estate and raising their children, forming a bond born of shared purpose rather than initial passion. Others contend that the initial lack of choice fundamentally limited the possibility of true romantic love, reducing relationships to transactional partnerships that, while functional, rarely touched the heart in the way we understand love today. It's a debate that delves into the very nature of human emotion versus societal structure, and it's far from settled. But let's be clear, the initial motivation was rarely, if ever, love. Think about the sheer weight of responsibility resting on the shoulders of the medieval lord or lady making these decisions. Their family's survival, their status, their very future depended on these marital alliances. It wasn't a choice. It was a duty to their ancestors, who had built the family's standing, often through bloodshed and cunning, and a duty to their descendants, whose future they were now shaping. The idea of marrying for love would have seemed utterly frivolous, even irresponsible, to them. Love was a bonus, a happy accident if it occurred, but never the primary driver. It was about solidifying power, expanding influence, and ensuring that your name, your house, your lands continued for generations to come. Every marriage was a strategic move on the grand chessboard of medieval power politics. It was about securing the next generation of your name, your crest, your ancestral lands. The individual was secondary to the lineage. You were a vessel, a conduit for the family's continued existence. Imagine the endless, painstaking negotiations, not just between the prospective bride and groom's families, but often involving powerful overlords, the church, and even the king, who might have a vested interest in the outcome of such a significant union. Every single detail was scrutinized. The size of the dowry, the rights of the wife over her own property, the provisions for her widowhood, and, of course, the specific terms for the inheritance of children. These weren't quick chats over coffee. These were protracted, complex discussions that could span months, sometimes years, often involving legal experts and scribes. The parchment scrolls detailing these arrangements would be dense with clauses, ensuring that every possible contingency for lineage and property was covered, from the birth of a male heir to the unfortunate event of a childless union. It's almost mind-boggling how meticulously they planned for the future, all centered around the continuation of the family name and the protection of its assets. It makes modern prenuptial agreements look like a napkin scribble by comparison. Can you picture the flickering candlelight illuminating those dense documents, the scratch of the quill pen as the terms were meticulously laid out, clause by painstaking clause? Feel the chill in the stone halls as powerful men, and sometimes equally powerful women, debated the fate of their children, weighing assets against alliances, blood against gold? It's a world where the rustle of a legal document held more weight than the flutter of a heart, and the quiet sigh of a young woman or a young man, knowing their destiny was being carved out for them, not by them. The soft echo of footsteps in a deserted corridor, perhaps, as they contemplate a future chosen for them, not by them, a future where their personal happiness was a distant, almost irrelevant, consideration compared to the survival of their family's name and fortune. So, when you think about medieval love, put away the images of knights serenading maidens under moonlit balconies for a moment. Instead, picture a ledger, a really, really big ledger. Because for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the powerful elite, marriage was fundamentally about accounting. Accounting for heirs, accounting for property, and accounting for the continued survival and prosperity of the family line. It wasn't about love, not in the way we understand it today. It was about legacy, and that, my friends, is a truth as solid as any medieval castle wall. And so, as the flickering lamplight casts long, dancing shadows across your chamber walls, you settle deeper into the cushions, letting the soft drone of my voice transport you back, to a time where the very concept of childhood, as we understand it today, was, well, a bit of a luxury. You see, when we talk about love and marriage in the medieval period, it's impossible to ignore the tiny, often silent, figures that were at the very heart of these unions. The children. But don't picture cherubic infants gurgling in designer cribs or toddlers attending early learning programs. Oh no. Here, children were less about cuddles and more about duty and survival, primarily survival. You might imagine a medieval nursery, perhaps with a doting mother cooing over her newborn. But the stark reality of the era paints a far grimmer picture. The air hangs heavy with the scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented nurseries of your imagination. The sound you hear most often isn't a baby's contented sigh, but perhaps a hacking cough or the quiet, desperate whimper of hunger. Because, let's be brutally honest, the medieval world was a perilous place for anyone, but especially for the very young. You see, a mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked in romantic retellings is the truly astronomical rate of infant and child mortality. We're talking about an era where it was not uncommon for half, or even more, of all children born to not survive past their 5th birthday. Think about that for a moment. You're not just having a baby, you're embarking on a high-stakes lottery, where the odds are stacked against your tiny contestant from day one. This wasn't just a sad statistic, it profoundly shaped attitudes. When you live in a world where disease sweeps through villages like a relentless reaper, where famine is a constant threat, and where even a simple cut can lead to a fatal infection, you learn to steel yourself. Emotional attachment, as we understand it, was a dangerous vulnerability. It's not that parents didn't love their children. It's that the expression of that love was tempered by an ever-present specter of loss. You might find a mother holding her child close, yes, but also preparing herself, perhaps subconsciously, for the possibility that this precious, fragile life might not endure. It's a quiet, aching understanding that permeates the very fabric of medieval family life. Consider the journey from birth. For many noble or wealthy families, the first encounter a baby might have with its mother after birth wasn't a long, intimate one. Instead, it was often with a wet nurse. Wealthy women, burdened by social expectations and the demands of managing a large household, or perhaps simply recovering from the ordeal of childbirth, frequently employed wet nurses to breastfeed their infants. This wasn't a slight against maternal love. It was a practical arrangement. A wet nurse, often a woman from a lower social standing who had recently given birth herself, would live with the family, providing nourishment and care. The baby would be handed over, often for months, sometimes even years. You might find yourself wondering, as you drift deeper into this historical reverie, if this practice created an emotional distance. Did it make it easier for parents to cope with the inevitable losses? Or was it simply a division of labor, A practical solution in a world where disease was rampant and maternal health was precarious? Historians still argue whether the widespread use of wet nurses truly impacted the depth of early maternal bonding, or if it was simply an accepted social norm with little emotional consequence. It's a subtle but significant question, isn't it? As for the children who did survive those treacherous early years, their journey into adulthood was swift and unforgiving. Forget your extended adolescence and your gap years. In the medieval world, childhood, as a distinct period of protected innocence, was a remarkably short affair. By modern standards, medieval children were often treated as miniature adults, thrust into responsibilities at an age you'd expect them to be playing with Lego. If you were a peasant child, your little hands would be put to work as soon as they were capable of grasping a hoe or tending to a flock. You'd be out in the fields, helping with the harvest, gathering firewood, tending livestock. There was no time for idle play when survival depended on every single family member contributing to the communal effort. It was a bit like a medieval co-op, but with much higher stakes and fewer organic kale smoothies. Even for noble children, life wasn't a prolonged holiday. Far from it. Their upbringing was meticulously planned, not for their personal happiness, but for their future utility. A son, the precious heir, was an investment. His education wasn't about exploring his passions. It was about preparing him to inherit, to lead, to fight, and to secure the family's standing. From a young age, perhaps as early as 7 or 8, he might be sent away from home to another noble household to serve as a page. Here, he would learn manners, horse riding, hunting, and basic literacy. It was an apprenticeship in nobility, a rigorous training program designed to mold him into a worthy successor. Imagine being packed off to boarding school at 7, but instead of algebra, you're learning how to correctly polish a knight's armor or serve dinner without spilling the gravy. It makes your current school run seem positively leisurely, doesn't it? For a noble daughter, her upbringing was equally practical, though perhaps less physically demanding. Her education focused on household management, needlework, perhaps some Latin for religious texts, and the social graces necessary to attract a suitable husband. She was, after all, a valuable commodity in the marriage market, a living bridge to forge alliances and consolidate power. Her skills were designed to make her an efficient mistress of a grand estate and a suitable companion for her future husband, who, as we've discussed, she likely wouldn't have chosen herself. It was less about finding her inner goddess and more about mastering the art of running a very large, very drafty, very complicated household. One quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the practical nature of medieval childhood is the prevalence of swaddling. Babies were often tightly wrapped in long strips of linen or wool, from head to toe, effectively immobilizing them. This wasn't just for warmth. It was believed to ensure that their limbs grew straight and to prevent them from scratching themselves or wriggling out of their beds. It was also, quite practically, a way to keep infants still and contained in a busy, often dangerous household without dedicated baby-proofing. So, while you might imagine a medieval baby enjoying tummy time, they were more likely to be resembling a tiny, perfectly wrapped burrito for the better part of their infancy. It might seem a bit extreme to us, but in a world without playpens or baby monitors, it made a certain kind of sense. Discipline was also a fundamental part of medieval upbringing, regardless of social class. The idea of sparing the rod and spoiling the child was not just a proverb, it was a guiding principle. Physical chastisement was common and widely accepted as a necessary tool for instilling obedience and preparing children for a harsh world. It wasn't necessarily about cruelty, but about shaping character, ensuring respect for authority, and teaching resilience. A medieval parent might believe they were doing their child a kindness by toughening them up, much like a drill sergeant prepares a recruit for battle. The world outside the castle walls, or the peasant hut, was unforgiving, and children needed to be ready. So, when you consider the love within medieval families, it wasn't always expressed in the effusive, demonstrative ways we're accustomed to. It was a love often born of necessity, of shared struggle, and of the desperate hope for survival. It was a love that manifested in ensuring a child was fed, clothed, and educated in the ways of their world, even if that education involved chores from a young age or being sent away from home. It was a love that understood the child's role as a future contributor to the family's legacy. a link in the chain of generations. The emotional bonds were there, undoubtedly, but they were woven into a tapestry of duty, practicality, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. As you picture the children of this distant past, remember they weren't just miniature versions of us. Their world demanded a different kind of resilience, a different kind of childhood. Their innocence was fleeting, their responsibilities began early, and their very existence was a testament to the harsh realities of a world where survival was the ultimate achievement. And yet, through it all, the human spirit, even in its smallest forms, found ways to endure, to learn, and to prepare for the monumental task of carrying on the family name, and with it, the very essence of medieval life. Now, as you settle deeper into your imaginary velvet armchair, perhaps with a warm mug of something comforting, let's peel back another layer of this grand tapestry we call the Middle Ages. We've touched on how marriage was less about heart flutters and more about land deeds. But what did all this mean for the person at the very center of these arrangements? What about the women? Oh, dear listener, prepare yourself for a journey into a world where choices were as scarce as a truly comfortable pair of medieval shoes. You see, for medieval women, life was less a choose-your-own-adventure novel and more a pre-written script, often penned by men, for men, and with very few exciting plot twists for the female lead. Imagine you are born into this world, a girl. From the moment you draw your first breath, your path is largely predetermined. If you're born into a noble family, you're a valuable commodity, a pawn in the intricate chess game of alliances and dynastic ambition. Your value isn't measured in your wit or charm, but in the size of your dowry and the strategic advantage your family gains from your union. You might be betrothed before you can even walk, your future husband a name on a parchment, perhaps decades your senior. No swiping left or right here, my friend. It's more like a forced subscription service you can't cancel. And if you're born into a peasant family, well, your future is equally set, just with more mud and less silk. Your hands will be calloused from toil, your back bent from the fields, and your marriage will be about survival, about pooling labor and meager resources, about ensuring the next generation can work the land. Education, for most women, wasn't about Latin verbs or philosophical debates. Oh no, it was intensely practical. If you were lucky enough to be of the nobility, you might learn to read and write a little, primarily for managing household accounts or reading devotional texts. Perhaps a smattering of French if you were really fancy. But your core curriculum involved needlework, managing a sprawling household, which was often a small village in itself, complete with dozens of servants and complex logistics, and mastering the subtle arts of social graces and piety. You'd learn to oversee brewing, baking, spinning, weaving, and the preparation of medicines. You'd learn how to host, how to supervise, and how to maintain the family's social standing. It's like being trained to be the CEO of a small, self-sufficient empire without any of the actual executive power. For peasant women, education was even more direct. How to churn butter, how to milk a cow, how to harvest crops, how to mend clothes, how to raise children who would survive infancy. There was no room for idle hands or intellectual curiosity, only the constant hum of necessity. The biggest, most inescapable destiny for most medieval women was marriage. It wasn't a question of if you would marry, but whom and when. Your parents or your guardians, if you were an orphan, held all the cards. Your feelings? Frankly, they were irrelevant. It's a bit like ordering a pizza and being told, "We've already chosen the toppings for you, and no, you don't get a say." The goal was to secure lineage, property, and alliances. Personal affection was a bonus, a happy accident, not a prerequisite. Once married, your legal identity, if you had much of one to begin with, effectively vanished. This is a mainstream historical fact known as coverture. Under coverture, a married woman was legally subsumed by her husband. She couldn't own property independently, sign contracts, or represent herself in court without his permission. Her earnings belonged to him. It was as if she became a permanent minor, her husband acting as her guardian in all legal matters. This created a profound dependency, locking women into their marital roles with very few avenues for escape or self-determination. Within the confines of marriage, a woman's primary role was to manage the household and, crucially, to bear children, especially sons. This wasn't just a biological function, it was a societal imperative. Every pregnancy was a gamble, a roll of the dice in an era of rudimentary medicine and high mortality rates. Childbirth was terrifyingly dangerous, a leading cause of death for women. Even if you survived, the responsibility of raising multiple children, often in quick succession, was immense. You were expected to be fertile, obedient, chaste, and quiet. The ideal medieval woman was often depicted as pious, humble, and industrious. Any deviation from these virtues could bring shame upon her, her husband, and her entire family. It was a role that demanded immense resilience, physical and emotional, often with little recognition beyond the continued functioning of the household. What if marriage wasn't for you? What if the idea of being legally absorbed by a stranger, or the constant drudgery of domestic life, filled you with existential dread? Well, for some, particularly noble women, there was an alternative, albeit a very specific one: the convent. Becoming a nun offered a different kind of life, one centered on spiritual devotion, prayer, and communal living. In some convents, especially those led by powerful abbesses, women could gain an education, pursue intellectual endeavors, and even exert significant administrative and economic power. Abbesses, for example, often managed vast estates, commanded respect from secular lords, and served as spiritual guides. It was a unique pocket of agency in a world largely devoid of it for women. However, even this choice was often dictated by family circumstances. Perhaps you were a surplus daughter, or your dowry wasn't large enough for a desirable marriage. It wasn't always a calling. Sometimes it was simply the most respectable option for a woman who wasn't going to be married off. It's like being offered a choice between two very specific flavors of medieval gruel, when all you really wanted was a chocolate chip cookie. Despite the prevailing narrative of female subservience, there were fascinating, if rare, instances of women pushing against the boundaries. For example, a quirky tidbit: while most trades were male-dominated, women in medieval towns often played crucial roles in specific industries. They were frequently involved in brewing ale, baking bread, spinning and weaving textiles, and even working as midwives or apothecaries. Some women even inherited and managed their husbands' businesses, particularly if they were widows, demonstrating a capacity for shrewd economic management. Historians still argue whether these instances represent genuine, albeit limited, economic independence, or if they were merely temporary necessities within a system that still largely restricted women's overall autonomy. Was it a crack in the patriarchal wall, or just a window that quickly slammed shut when a male heir came of age? The debate continues. The pressure to conform was immense. Adultery, as we've touched on, carried severe consequences, especially for women. A woman's chastity was paramount, directly tied to her family's honor and the legitimacy of her children, and therefore the inheritance. A man's indiscretions were often overlooked, but a woman's could lead to public shaming, disinheritance, or even severe physical punishment. It was a deeply asymmetrical system where the burden of moral purity fell disproportionately on female shoulders. It's enough to make you think medieval dating apps would have had some very complicated terms and conditions. In essence, a medieval woman, regardless of her social standing, navigated a world of profound limitations. Her life was largely defined by her relationships to men, first her father, then her husband, and later, perhaps, her sons. Her value was often tied to her reproductive capacity and her ability to manage a household efficiently. There were no career days in medieval schools. No guidance counselors suggesting she pursue her dreams of becoming a knight or a philosopher. Her dreams, if she dared to have them, were likely confined to the domestic sphere or to the spiritual solace of the church. It was a life of duty, expectation, and often quiet resilience. Now, as you gently drift further into the quiet shadows of the past, let's peel back another layer of that romanticized medieval tapestry. You've likely encountered the concept of courtly love, a gleaming, idealized vision of knights, fair ladies, and declarations of undying, often unrequited, devotion. You picture a chivalrous warrior, perhaps in shining armor, kneeling before a noblewoman, pledging his life, his sword, his very soul to her service. You imagine secret glances, whispered poems, and a devotion so pure it transcends earthly bonds. It's the stuff of legends, the very heart of medieval romance in our modern minds. But lean in close and let the truth softly unfold, for this shimmering ideal, while beautiful, was overwhelmingly a carefully constructed fantasy. A literary game played out on parchment, rarely reflecting the messy, pragmatic realities of medieval life and love. You see, the idea of courtly love wasn't born from the day-to-day interactions between medieval husbands and wives, or even between eager young lovers hoping to marry. Oh no, this intricate dance originated in the sophisticated courts of southern France, in a region called Occitania, during the 12th century. It sprang forth from the minds of talented poets and musicians known as troubadours. These were the rock stars of their era, wandering from castle to castle, entertaining the nobility with their lyrical compositions. And what did they sing about? Not the joys of a well-arranged marriage or the comfort of a shared hearth. They sang of an exquisite, often agonizing, type of love that was almost always outside the bonds of matrimony. This is our mainstream historical fact. Courtly love, or fin amour as it was sometimes called, was primarily a literary invention of the troubadour tradition, a poetic construct designed for entertainment and intellectual stimulation within aristocratic circles. Imagine, if you will, being a noble lady in a grand, drafty castle. Your marriage has been meticulously arranged since childhood, a strategic alliance of lands, titles, and lineage. Your husband is likely a distant cousin, or a powerful neighbor, or perhaps a grizzled veteran of various skirmishes. He's probably more concerned with the state of his fields, the loyalty of his vassals, or the next potential skirmish than with composing sonnets to your beauty. You're expected to manage the household, bear heirs, and maintain the social order. Into this rather practical existence, the troubadour arrives. He doesn't sing of your excellent needlework or your efficient estate management. Instead, he sings of your ethereal beauty, your unattainable grace, your cruel indifference, and his own utter devotion, a love that purifies him, inspires him to feats of valor, and yet can never truly be consummated. It's a delightful escape, isn't it? A delicious, vicarious thrill in a life often devoid of personal choice or passionate romance. It's like today's most dramatic reality TV show, but with more loots and less actual conflict resolution. The rules of this courtly game were incredibly specific, almost comically so, when you consider them applied to real life. The knight, the lover, was always subservient to the lady, who was almost always of higher social standing, usually married, and often the wife of his lord. His love for her was meant to be ennobling, inspiring him to acts of chivalry, bravery, and moral excellence. He would perform valiant deeds in her name, endure hardships, and suffer silently for her approval. The love was meant to be secret, often unrequited, and crucially, unconsummated. The purity of the love was often tied to its spiritual, non-physical nature. Can you imagine the sheer impracticality? Darling, I've just ridden 3 days through a blizzard, battled a dragon, and rescued a princess, all for your favor. Now, if you'll just acknowledge my existence with a nod, I'll be off to polish my armor. It's like trying to follow a medieval instruction manual written by someone who'd never actually met a person. This ideal was, in many ways, a sophisticated form of escapism for the aristocracy. Their real marriages were economic and political contracts, designed to secure property, consolidate power, and produce legitimate heirs. There was little room for personal affection, let alone passionate, illicit love. Courtly love offered a safe, fictional outlet for these emotions. It allowed for the exploration of intense feeling, devotion, and desire, all within the confines of a literary framework that posed no real threat to the established social order. After all, if the love remained unconsummated, it didn't disrupt the lineage, didn't threaten the dowry, and didn't invite the very harsh consequences of actual adultery. And make no mistake, actual adultery in medieval society came with severe repercussions, as we briefly touched upon. For women, it could mean public shaming, disinheritance, or even death. For men, while less severe, it could still result in social ostracization, financial penalties, or loss of status. The church, too, held a powerful sway, defining marriage as a sacred sacrament for procreation and order, frowning upon any sexual activity outside its bounds. So, while a knight might pen a poem about his undying devotion to his lord's wife, he'd be very careful not to actually act on it, unless he fancied a very short, very painful life. Imagine trying to explain that to your mother-in-law, who's just worried about the next harvest and the legitimacy of her grandchildren. "Oh, don't worry, mother. It's just a literary infatuation. Good luck with that." There's even a quirky, fringe tidbit associated with courtly love, the concept of courts of love. Legend has it that these were actual tribunals, presided over by noblewomen, where complex romantic dilemmas were debated and judged according to the principles of courtly love. For example, can true love exist between married people? The answer, according to one famous ruling, was often no, because true love required freedom of choice, which arranged marriages lacked. While these courts made for fascinating literary scenes and intellectual exercises, historians still argue whether the courts of love were actual judicial bodies with real authority or purely literary constructs and playful social games amongst the aristocracy. It's unlikely they held any actual legal power, but they certainly highlight the intellectual, almost academic way in which courtly love was approached. It was a philosophy as much as a feeling. So, when you read tales of Lancelot and Guinevere or Tristan and Isolde, you're not reading about typical medieval relationships. You're entering a world of heightened emotion, impossible ideals, and dramatic narratives that provided an escape from the mundane. These stories were incredibly popular precisely because they offered a contrast to the reality. They allowed the nobility to imagine a world where love was freely chosen, intensely felt, and profoundly transformative, even if it led to tragedy. It was a sophisticated game, a form of self-improvement for the knight, who was supposed to become a better, more virtuous person through his devotion, and a way to elevate the status of the noble lady within the courtly sphere. The courtly love tradition also played a significant role in shaping the concept of chivalry. Knights were not just warriors. They were supposed to be refined, cultured, honorable, and devoted to their ladies. This idealization of the knightly figure, however, was often at odds with the brutal realities of warfare and feudal life. It was a code of conduct that was aspirational, a set of manners and morals to strive for, rather than a universal practice. You might find a knight who could quote poetry and fight valiantly, but he was still likely to be pragmatic, ruthless, and concerned with land and power. Ultimately, courtly love was a beautiful, intricate, and profoundly influential literary phenomenon that shaped our modern understanding of romance. But it was a dream, a whisper on the wind, a meticulously crafted illusion. It was a space where emotions could bloom wildly, unconstrained by the heavy chains of property, lineage, and social expectation. It was a magnificent fantasy, allowed to flourish because it largely remained just that, a fantasy, confined to the pages of illuminated manuscripts and the verses sung by troubadours, gently caressing the ears of noble ladies who, after the performance, would return to their very real, very practical, and often very unromantic lives. As you settle deeper into your pillow, you might find yourself picturing a different kind of medieval scene, not the muddy fields or the grim castle walls, but a sun-drenched courtyard, perhaps with a lute gently strumming. This is where we meet the troubadours, those wandering poets and musicians who, quite frankly, were the rock stars of their day, if rock stars wore tunics and sang about unrequited love instead of smashing guitars. They were the original architects of the romantic ideal, crafting a vision of love that was as far removed from the daily grind of medieval marriage as your morning commute is from a dragon flight. Imagine, if you will, being transported to the sun-drenched region of Occitania, in what is now southern France, around the 11th century. This is the birthplace of the troubadour movement, where these lyrical poets first began to compose and perform their songs, known as cansos, in the Occitan language. They weren't just singing catchy tunes. They were weaving intricate tapestries of devotion, longing, and unattainable desire. They were paid, of course, often by noble patrons, to entertain and to elevate the status of the lords and ladies they served, but their true legacy lies in the emotional landscapes they painted. You see, while your average medieval lord was busy calculating dowries and inspecting his future bride's childbearing hips, The troubadours were off in a corner, strumming their lutes and dreaming up scenarios where love was a lofty, almost spiritual pursuit. This was courtly love, or fin amour, a concept so divorced from reality, it makes modern reality TV look like a documentary. It wasn't about the grimy, practical realities of sharing a bed with someone you barely knew and probably didn't fancy. Oh no, courtly love was about adoration from afar, about noble suffering, about proving your worth through chivalrous deeds, all for the sake of a high-born lady, the Domna, who was almost invariably married to someone else. It was a bit like having a crush on a celebrity you'll never meet, but then dedicating your entire life to writing epic poems about how beautiful their smile is. Except, with more jousting. These troubadours, often men of humble birth who rose through their poetic talents, would travel from court to court, performing their elaborate compositions. Picture the scene. A great hall, maybe a roaring fire in the hearth, shadows dancing on the stone walls, and there, in the flickering light, a lone figure with a musical instrument, his voice echoing with tales of a knight's desperate devotion to a lady he could never truly possess. The audience, largely composed of the very nobles who were trapped in their own pragmatic unions, would listen intently, perhaps sighing wistfully, escaping, for a few precious moments, into a world where love was pure, unblemished, and utterly impractical. It was the medieval equivalent of binge-watching a particularly sappy romantic comedy after a long, hard day of negotiating grain prices and fending off bandits. The core of this courtly love wasn't about physical consummation. In fact, that was often seen as a betrayal of the ideal. Instead, it was about the process of loving, the yearning, the service, the self-improvement inspired by the lady's perfection. It was a highly stylized game, full of rules and rituals, where the lover, the troubadour or the knight he represented, would strive to win the favor of his lady, not through marriage, but through a shared glance, a token, or perhaps a kind word. It was a performance, a social convention, a sophisticated form of role-playing that provided an emotional outlet far removed from the constraints of arranged marriages. Imagine dedicating years of your life to serenading someone's wife, only for her to finally say, "Oh, thank you. That was lovely. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go supervise the pig slaughter." It really puts a damper on the romantic spirit, doesn't it? This stark contrast between the troubadour's idealized visions and the everyday marital realities is crucial to understanding medieval love. Marriages, as we've discussed, were about alliances, land, and heirs. They were contracts. Courtly love, on the other hand, was about emotion, aspiration, and often frustration. It was the ultimate poetic escapism. It allowed people to imagine a world where love was a choice, a grand passion, rather than a duty. It gave them permission to dream of a connection based on something deeper than shared property lines. You might wonder, did anyone actually live this courtly love? Did knights truly spend their lives pining for unattainable ladies without ever making a move? Well, historians still argue whether courtly love was ever truly practiced beyond the literary realm, or if it was purely a theoretical construct, a sophisticated game played by the aristocracy. Some scholars suggest it was a way to channel potentially disruptive passions into harmless, artistic expression, a kind of social pressure valve. Others believe it might have subtly influenced real emotional bonds, even within the confines of arranged marriages, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of affection. But one thing is clear: it was a world apart from the legal and social framework of marriage. It was the fan fiction of its era, wildly popular but rarely reflective of the real-world relationships. Consider the courts of love that occasionally popped up, particularly in the later medieval period. These were gatherings where aristocratic ladies would preside over mock trials, debating intricate points of love and chivalry. For example, they might decide whether a knight who was secretly in love with a lady was more honorable than one who openly declared his affection. It was a bit like a medieval debate club, but instead of arguing about taxation, they were arguing about the precise etiquette of pining. These were not courts of law. They were social salons, reinforcing the idea that courtly love was a complex, intellectual game, a form of sophisticated entertainment for the elite. It's hard to imagine a medieval peasant, after a long day of tilling the fields, sitting down to debate the nuances of a knight's unrequited affection. Their idea of a complex emotional debate was probably whether to eat the last turnip now or save it for tomorrow. The influence of these troubadours, and their northern French counterparts, the trouvères, was profound. They didn't just sing songs, they shaped cultural narratives. They codified the very language of romance that we still use today. Think of the tropes. The knight in shining armor, the damsel in distress, even if she was, in reality, a powerful noblewoman, the grand gestures of devotion. These were all born, or at least heavily popularized, by the troubadour tradition. They were the original influencers, selling an aspirational lifestyle of grand passion and noble suffering, even if the reality for most people was far less glamorous. It's like scrolling through Instagram today and seeing perfectly curated lives. You know it's not entirely real, but it still makes you sigh a little, doesn't it? So, while medieval marriage was a carefully constructed fortress of practicality, the troubadours offered a window into a secret garden of idealized emotion. They created a space where the human heart could dream beyond the confines of duty and survival. They articulated a yearning for connection that transcended the transactional nature of daily life. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of romance, even if that groundwork was built on a foundation of poetic license and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. They were the dream weavers, reminding people that even in a harsh world, there was still room for beauty, for longing, and for the exquisite pain of an unrequited crush. So, you've been dreaming of gallant knights and fair ladies, sighing dramatically under moonlit balconies, perhaps even exchanging a stolen kiss or two. Oh, bless your sweet, modern heart. While the troubadours spun their tales of idealized, often illicit passion, the actual medieval world had a rather different, and far less forgiving, take on stepping outside the marital lines. If you thought a medieval marriage was all about property deeds and family trees, just wait until you peek behind the curtain at what happened when someone dared to scribble outside those very strict lines. You see, the stakes were astronomically high, not just for your soul, but for your very skin and social standing. Imagine, if you will, the quiet, almost suffocating weight of societal expectation pressing down on you. In a world where marriage wasn't a fuzzy feeling but a bedrock contract, a legal, economic, and spiritual pact, adultery wasn't just a mistake. It was an act of profound betrayal. It struck at the core of social order, threatened property inheritance, and, perhaps most damningly, cast a shadow of illegitimacy over potential heirs. And let's be brutally honest, in this patriarchal landscape, the consequences for men and women were as wildly unequal as, well, a knight's annual income versus a peasant's. For a man, straying from his marital bed, while certainly frowned upon by the church, often carried a lighter social and legal burden, unless he dared to defile a woman of higher status or another man's wife, which was a direct affront to that man's honor and property. It was a bit like getting a parking ticket versus having your car impounded. Annoying, but rarely life-altering. You might face a fine, a stern talking to from the local priest, or a reputation ding that could be smoothed over with enough coin or influence. Perhaps a bit of light social awkwardness at the next village feast. Oh, there's Gerald. You might hear whispers. The one who wandered. Mildly embarrassing, yes, but not exactly career-ending for a medieval lord. But for a woman? Oh, honey, for a woman, adultery was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. It wasn't just a sin. It was a crime against her husband, his lineage, his property, and the very fabric of society. The moment a woman was suspected of adultery, her world could collapse with the swiftness of a poorly constructed wattle and daub hut. Her reputation, which was her most valuable asset in a world where her worth was tied to her chastity and her ability to produce legitimate heirs, was utterly shattered. You could almost hear the collective gasp of the village, followed by the immediate, chilling silence of ostracization. The smell of fear, perhaps, mingled with the usual medieval aromas of pigsty and stale ale, would hang heavy in the air. Legally, the repercussions were often brutal and designed to serve as a stark warning to anyone else contemplating such a transgression. Depending on the region and the specific legal codes, which, remember, varied wildly across the patchwork quilt of medieval Europe, a woman convicted of adultery could face a dizzying array of punishments. You might think, surely, they just got a divorce, right? Oh, sweet summer child, annulment was a near impossibility, as we'll gently discover later, and divorce as we understand it simply didn't exist. So, the marriage remained, a broken shell, but the punishment for the breach was very real. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this gender disparity is the widespread legal principle that a husband could, in many legal traditions across Europe, kill his wife and her lover in flagranti delicto caught in the act, with little to no legal repercussion. This wasn't just a right. It was often seen as upholding his honor and protecting his lineage. Meanwhile, a wife who found her husband with another woman had virtually no similar legal recourse, beyond perhaps a plea to the church court for spiritual guidance or penance for her errant spouse, which, let's be honest, probably felt about as effective as asking a dragon to give up its gold. Then there were the public shaming rituals, which were designed to inflict maximum humiliation and serve as a chilling deterrent. Imagine being paraded through the muddy, cobbled streets of your village, perhaps with your hair shorn, or wearing a sign proclaiming your crimes for all to see. Sometimes the punishment involved being stripped or partially stripped and led through the town, subjected to the jeers and rotten vegetables thrown by your former neighbors. It was the medieval equivalent of going viral, but instead of likes, you got public disgust. You might be forced to wear a distinctive, often garish, piece of clothing, a kind of real-life scarlet letter, before Nathaniel Hawthorne even dreamed of it, marking you as an adulterer wherever you went. It was a brand not on your skin but on your very existence. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the cucking stool or ducking stool. While primarily used for scolding women and unruly tradespeople, these devices were sometimes adapted for adulterers, particularly women. You'd be strapped into a chair, sometimes one that could be lowered into a pond or river, and subjected to public ridicule and immersion. Imagine the cold shock of the water, the gasps for air, the relentless jeers from the crowd, all while you're soaked to the bone and utterly humiliated. It was a truly unpleasant dip, far worse than a bad hair day. And no, there was no fancy medieval spa treatment afterwards to ease your discomfort. Beyond the public spectacle, the legal ramifications were severe. A woman could lose her dowry, the property she brought into the marriage, which would revert back to her family or, in some cases, be forfeited to her husband. Her dower rights, the portion of her husband's property she was entitled to for her support upon his death, could also be revoked. This left her financially destitute and socially ruined, often with no means of support. She might be banished from the community, condemned to a life of wandering or forced into a monastic institution, not out of piety, but as a form of social exile. The church, ever vigilant, would also step in, imposing penance, excommunication, or other spiritual punishments, ensuring that your eternal soul got a good lashing too. Even more extreme punishments, though less common in later medieval periods, were not unheard of. In some Germanic legal traditions, for example, a woman found guilty of adultery could be subjected to severe physical mutilation, such as having her nose or ears cut off, or even being whipped to death. While these were generally reserved for the most egregious cases or specific regional customs, the threat of such brutality hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the absolute power wielded by husbands and communities over women's bodies and lives. You really wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of the local lord's temper, or the community's moral outrage. You see, the entire system was designed to maintain order, uphold patriarchal control, and protect the sanctity of lineage. Adultery, especially on the woman's part, represented chaos, a direct challenge to the neat, carefully constructed world of inherited power and property. It was seen as a betrayal of trust on every conceivable level, from the personal to the divine. Now, historians still argue whether these extreme punishments were consistently applied across the social spectrum, or if they served more as a powerful deterrent, a legal bogeyman whispered in the dark, than a frequent reality for the average person. Was every suspected adulterer dragged through the streets? Or were these laws primarily aimed at the elite, whose indiscretions posed a greater threat to the social fabric? We know that for the wealthy, fines might be preferred over public humiliation, and influence could often soften the blow. But for the common folk, whose lives were already teetering on the edge of subsistence, the threat of social ostracization and financial ruin was a very real, very terrifying prospect. So, while tales of chivalric love might have painted a picture of daring romance, the reality of medieval adultery was a stark, brutal landscape of severe social ostracization, crippling legal penalties, and public humiliation. It was a world where a momentary lapse in judgment, or a genuine emotional connection outside the bounds of a pragmatic marriage, could shatter your life beyond repair. Forget the roses and the secret rendezvous. Think more about the stocks, the jeering crowd, and the very real risk of losing everything you held dear, including your reputation, your property, and sometimes even your life. Romantic, isn't it? Definitely not the kind of drama you'd want to star in. You've learned how tightly the medieval world tried to rein in love, stuffing it into the neat, often uncomfortable box of strategic marriage. But even the most rigid societal structures, you see, can't entirely extinguish the human heart's inconvenient desires. So, as you snuggle deeper into your pillows, let's pull back the heavy velvet curtain on the less talked about, often shadowy, forms of affection that dared to exist beyond the wedding vows. This was the wild, untamed garden just outside the manicured, church-approved lawn, where other kinds of connections, for better or worse, bloomed in defiance. First, let's talk about concubines and mistresses. Oh, the scandal, or rather, the not-so-scandalous truth for those at the top. While the church thundered about monogamy and the sanctity of marriage, and you, a commoner, faced severe repercussions for any marital transgression, the powerful often operated by a different rulebook. For kings, dukes, bishops, and even popes, yes, you heard that right, popes having a mistress or a long-term concubine was, shall we say, an open secret, often tolerated, and sometimes even a matter of public knowledge. It was almost like a medieval loophole, if you will, where the rules were more like gentle suggestions for those with enough influence or enough gold. It's a mainstream historical fact that many high-ranking medieval figures, from monarchs to powerful clergy, maintained concubines, and in some cases, even acknowledged the children born from these unions, sometimes granting them positions or titles. Imagine the whispered gossip in the great halls, the rustle of expensive fabrics as these unofficial partners navigated court life, often with a surprising degree of influence. Sometimes these women were well-educated, politically savvy, and became trusted confidants, almost acting as parallel power figures to the official wives. It was a peculiar dance, wasn't it? The same society that would condemn a peasant for illicit relations would turn a blind eye, or even tacitly approve, when a lord or a bishop had a companion who wasn't his wife. Perhaps they just assumed the rules were for the common folk, who, let's be honest, probably had enough trouble just trying to keep their livestock from wandering off, let alone worrying about papal decrees on fidelity. Then we shift from the gilded cages of the powerful to the bustling, often grimy, streets of medieval towns, where another type of non-marital affection, or rather transaction, was a stark reality: prostitution. It wasn't always hidden away in the darkest alleys, either. In a shocking twist, for a society so obsessed with sin, many medieval cities actually regulated prostitution. Yes, you heard that right. It wasn't just tolerated, it was often controlled, taxed, and sometimes even operated by civic authorities, or in some instances even by religious institutions. It's a quirky historical tidbit that in places like London, the stews, brothels, were famously located on the south bank of the Thames and were for centuries owned and licensed by the Bishop of Winchester. Imagine that, a bishop collecting rent from brothels. It makes you wonder if they offered a loyalty program. The rationale was often that it was a necessary evil, a way to contain unruly male sexual desire and prevent worse crimes, like rape or seduction of virtuous women. So, while a woman might be condemned for simply looking at a man the wrong way, another woman's body became a regulated commodity, a grim testament to the double standards of the age. The lives of these women were often desperate and dangerous, despite any regulations. They lived on the fringes, their existence a testament to economic hardship and societal hypocrisy. A stark reminder that love wasn't the only currency in medieval relationships. Now, let's tiptoe into the even more hidden corners of medieval affection: same-sex relationships. The church, as you might recall, had a very clear and very damning stance on anything that deviated from procreative heterosexual marriage. Homosexuality, or sodomy as it was broadly termed, was considered a grave sin, punishable by everything from public penance to execution. So, if you harbored feelings for someone of your own gender, you lived in a world of profound secrecy and immense danger. Yet, despite the fierce condemnation, evidence suggests these relationships existed. You find glimpses in legal records of accusations and punishments, confirming that it happened, even if it was brutally suppressed. You might also find whispers in literature, in coded language, or in the intensely emotional friendships documented in letters or monastic texts. Historians still argue whether certain intensely close, same-sex relationships observed in medieval monastic or courtly settings were purely platonic friendships, or if they contained unacknowledged romantic or even physical dimensions. Given the social pressures to conceal such affections, imagine the quiet, knowing glances across a crowded hall, the shared secret in a monastic cell, the carefully worded letters that spoke volumes without saying anything explicit. It was a world where affection had to wear a disguise, where love, if it dared to defy the sanctioned path, became a silent, dangerous rebellion. The human need for connection, for deep emotional and physical intimacy, simply refused to be legislated out of existence, even if it meant living a life in the shadows. Moving down the social ladder, away from the grand castles and bustling towns, you find a different kind of non-marital union among the peasantry. For the vast majority of people, the elaborate, church-sanctioned wedding ceremony, with its dowries and legal contracts, was often an expensive and impractical affair. So what did they do? They improvised. Many peasant couples simply lived together, considering themselves married in the eyes of their community and, perhaps in their own understanding of God's law, without ever stepping foot into a church for a formal ceremony. This was particularly common in areas where priests were scarce, or where the fees for marriage were prohibitive. You'd simply declare your intentions, maybe exchange a token or two, and start sharing a hut and a life. This was often called a common law marriage, or in some regions, a handfasting, a temporary or informal betrothal that could become permanent. It was a very practical solution to a very practical problem. When you're trying to put gruel on the table and keep the chickens from escaping, a fancy ceremony with Latin prayers might take a back seat to the urgent need for two pairs of hands to work the land and raise a family. The church, of course, frowned upon these informal unions, pushing for formal blessings, but the realities of peasant life often trumped ecclesiastical decrees. For them, love, or perhaps more accurately partnership, was forged in shared labor and mutual survival, often without the official stamp of approval. And finally, you have the myriad other forms of casual, illicit, or purely physical liaisons that existed across all social strata. From the fleeting encounters in taverns to the more sustained, but still forbidden, affairs that might spark between individuals trapped in loveless marriages or simply seeking connection outside the strictures of their lives. These were the relationships born of desperation, curiosity, or pure human desire, often carrying immense risks. Discovery could lead to social ruin, physical punishment, or even death, depending on the severity and the context. Yet, people took those risks. The medieval world, despite its stern moral pronouncements, was still populated by human beings with human needs and desires. The strictures around marriage, the emphasis on property and lineage, the limited choices for women, all these factors created an environment where unsanctioned affections were almost inevitable. They were the defiant whispers in a world that demanded silence, the secret smiles in a world that demanded conformity. It's a powerful reminder that while society can dictate the rules of love, it struggles to control the emotions that drive it, no matter how harsh the consequences. Now, if you thought parental pressure and dowry negotiations were the only hurdles in the medieval love game, buckle up, because here comes the ultimate player, the church. Imagine a giant, all-encompassing institution, not just dictating your spiritual life, but also your legal rights, your social standing, and, yes, the very fabric of your most intimate relationships. You see, the medieval church wasn't just a Sunday morning affair. It was the operating system for medieval society, and it had some very strong opinions about marriage. For centuries, marriage in Europe was a bit of a Wild West, legally speaking. It was often a private affair, a handshake agreement, a family contract, a local custom. You might have a feast, exchange some vows, maybe a priest would bless the union, but it wasn't always a formalized, universally recognized sacrament. The church, however, had grander plans. It saw marriage not just as a civil contract between two families, but as a sacred, holy bond instituted by God Himself. This wasn't just about making people feel good. It was about imposing order, channeling human passions, and securing the eternal salvation of souls. Think of it like a medieval startup that decided to pivot from just offering spiritual guidance to becoming the sole, legally recognized registrar for all interpersonal commitments. And they did it with surprising efficiency, given the lack of Wi-Fi. This transformation didn't happen overnight, of course. It was a slow, deliberate process, a centuries-long campaign by the church to bring matrimony under its direct control. You can almost picture the medieval bishops in a smoky backroom, sipping lukewarm ale, sketching out flowcharts for how to manage human reproduction and property lines. They weren't just thinking about love. They were thinking about sin, salvation, and social stability. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the church's influence reached its zenith. A mainstream historical fact that really cemented this power grab was the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This was a truly monumental event, a council of thousands of bishops and abbots, and it issued decrees that fundamentally reshaped medieval life. Among its many pronouncements, it declared marriage to be one of the 7 sacraments. This wasn't a casual upgrade. It meant marriage was now considered a divine channel of grace, an indissoluble bond forged by God Himself. But it didn't stop there. The council also mandated that marriages had to be publicly announced in advance, typically 3 times. These were called bans, to ensure there were no impediments to the union. No more secret elopements in the dead of night, hoping no one would notice. This was designed to prevent bigamy, incest by their definition, and other prohibited unions. It was the medieval equivalent of a pre-marriage background check, but instead of checking your credit score, they were checking your family tree for any inconveniently close relatives. So what was the church's definition of marriage? Well, it certainly wasn't about finding your soulmate or living happily ever after. The primary purpose, according to the church, was procreation. Be fruitful and multiply wasn't just a suggestion. It was a divine command. Sex within marriage was sanctified, but almost exclusively for the purpose of having children. Any other sexual acts, even within marriage, were often viewed with suspicion or outright condemned as sinful. It puts a bit of a damper on date night when the only approved activity is producing an heir, doesn't it? Not exactly rom-com material. The second key purpose was order. Marriage was seen as a way to channel human sexual urges into a legitimate and controlled framework, preventing promiscuity, illegitimacy, and social chaos. It was also considered a remedy for concupiscence, essentially a way to prevent lust and fornication. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of passionate love. Is it? More like a spiritual pressure valve. You were getting married not just for yourself or your family, but for the good of your soul and the stability of society. It was a civic duty wrapped in a sacred package. And once you were in, you were in. The church preached the absolute indissolubility of marriage. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Divorce, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. You couldn't just decide you weren't compatible anymore and split up. You were bound for life, in sickness and in health, even if your spouse turned out to be less charming and more constantly smells of goat. Imagine being stuck in an eternal group project with someone whose only contribution is chewing loudly and occasionally belching the alphabet. That's your life now. Annulment was the only way out, but that was a whole different beast, incredibly difficult to obtain, and usually reserved for cases where the marriage was deemed invalid from the start, which we'll delve into in a later section, so hold that thought. The church also laid down strict rules regarding who you couldn't marry. This is where things got delightfully complicated. The biggest hurdle was the concept of prohibited degrees of kinship, both by blood, consanguinity, and by marriage, affinity. This wasn't just your immediate family. It could extend surprisingly far, sometimes up to the 7th degree of kinship. This meant you couldn't marry your third cousin, or even the cousin of your spouse's former spouse. Trying to trace these lines was a genealogical nightmare, especially for noble families who needed to marry into other powerful lines without accidentally committing incest in the eyes of God and the Pope. A quirky or fringe tidbit here: the complexity of these consanguinity rules meant that sometimes, marriages that had lasted for decades and produced children could be suddenly declared invalid if some long-forgotten, distant relative was suddenly discovered to be related to your spouse's family. Imagine finding out your great-great-great-aunt twice removed was related to your spouse's family, and suddenly, poof, your marriage is null and void. Oh, darling, you'd have to say, turns out we're too related to be married. Pass the wine. It's been a long day. This was often conveniently exploited by powerful individuals looking for an excuse to discard an inconvenient spouse or secure a more advantageous union. Another significant impediment was a pre-contract. If you had already given your consent to marry someone else, even informally, that could invalidate a later marriage. This led to endless disputes, especially when one party tried to back out of an earlier promise. The Church also recognized other impediments like lack of age, impotence, insanity, coercion, you couldn't be forced into marriage, or an existing marriage. Despite the Church's push for public ceremonies and bans, there was still the persistent issue of clandestine marriages. These were marriages where a couple exchanged vows and gave consent to each other, but without a priest or witnesses. The Church, surprisingly, considered these unions valid, as the consent of the couple was the sacrament itself. However, they were strongly discouraged because they caused immense legal and social chaos, particularly when it came to inheritance and the legitimacy of children. Imagine trying to prove you were legally married when there's no record, no witnesses, just your word against someone else's. It was a nightmare. And this leads us to an open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the Church's efforts to regularize marriage truly permeated all levels of society, or if clandestine unions remained a widespread challenge, especially among the lower classes, long after the Fourth Lateran Council, highlighting a persistent gap between ecclesiastical ideal and lived reality. To enforce all these rules, the Church established its own system of ecclesiastical courts. These courts handled everything from disputes over marriage contracts and legitimacy to cases of adultery and other moral offenses. They could impose penance, fines, or even excommunication, which was essentially social and spiritual death in medieval society. The priest, acting as the Church's local representative, also played a crucial role, not just in performing the ceremony but in recording marriages and acting as a moral guide. You'd confess your sins to him, and he'd know if you were, shall we say, not adhering to the Church's very specific guidelines for marital relations. So, the Church's grip on matrimony was profound. It didn't just offer spiritual guidance. It defined the very terms of engagement, turning marriage from a largely private, familial arrangement into a sacred, indissoluble bond under its direct supervision. It dictated who you could marry, why you should marry, and what your obligations were once you were married. This wasn't about personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. It was about God, order, and the propagation of legitimate heirs within a divinely sanctioned framework. The Church transformed marriage into a cornerstone of its social and moral authority, shaping the lives of every man and woman in medieval Europe, whether they liked it or not. So, you've just wrapped your head around the Church's rather iron-fisted grip on what matrimony should be, defining it primarily as a sacred conduit for procreation and societal order. You're perhaps picturing a priest, stern-faced, overseeing a solemn vow. But hold that thought, because before anyone even got close to a stained glass window or a priestly blessing, there was a whole other, far more earthly transaction taking place. Forget your modern-day engagement rings and Pinterest boards. You're stepping into the smoky, candlelit chambers where medieval marriages were really forged. Welcome to the world of negotiated unions and dowries, where love was less a feeling and more a line item on a ledger. Imagine, if you will, the gentle rustle of heavy wool and the faint scent of stale ale clinging to the air. You're not at a romantic dinner. You're a fly on the wall in a negotiation room, probably somewhere cold and drafty. The table isn't set with flowers, but with parchment, quills, and perhaps a half-eaten pigeon. This isn't about two hearts finding each other. It's about two powerful families, or even just two ambitious ones, trying to find the best possible merger. Yes, a merger, because medieval marriage, especially among the nobility and wealthy gentry, was first and foremost a strategic economic and political arrangement. It was a grand game of chess where the pieces were land, titles, alliances, and future heirs. Who were the players at this particular chessboard? Rarely the prospective bride and groom themselves. Oh no, sweetie, their input was often about as relevant as the color of the napkins at a modern corporate meeting. The real heavy hitters were the parents, the guardians, perhaps an influential uncle, or even a king's emissary if the stakes were high enough. These were the people who understood the true currency of the age: power. And power, darling, was intrinsically linked to property and lineage. You see, for centuries, the vast majority of noble and even many wealthier peasant marriages were meticulously arranged, with financial and social considerations paramount. This isn't just a quirky historical footnote. It's a mainstream historical fact that shaped societies for hundreds of years. A daughter wasn't just a beloved child. She was a valuable asset, a strategic pawn in the grand game of family advancement. Her marriage could secure new lands, settle old feuds, gain military support, or even elevate a family's standing in the royal court. It was a colossal investment, and like any good investment, it required careful negotiation to ensure the best possible return. The negotiation process itself was often protracted, sometimes spanning months or even years. It wasn't a quick chat over coffee. You'd have emissaries traveling between estates, letters exchanged with incredibly formal language, and a flurry of legal drafts. Think of it like a corporate takeover, but with more heraldry and significantly less ethical oversight. They'd haggle over every detail: how much land would be transferred, what titles would be held jointly, what debts would be assumed, and crucially, what the bride would bring to the table, her dowry. Ah, the dowry. This is where things get truly fascinating, and perhaps a little bit transactional. The dowry was essentially the property or money that a bride brought with her to her husband upon marriage. It wasn't a gift from him to her. It was a contribution from her family to the new household, intended to help establish the couple, secure the wife's future, especially in widowhood, and, let's be honest, significantly boost the husband's wealth and status. It was, in many ways, the bride's financial value proposition in the marriage market. A larger dowry could secure a more prestigious husband, perhaps one with more land or a higher social standing. A smaller one, well, that severely limited your options, like trying to get into an exclusive club with a discount coupon for a local diner. What could a dowry consist of? Oh, the list was as varied as a medieval feast, though perhaps less delicious. It could be vast estates of land, a hefty sum of cash, though cash was less common than land or goods in the early Middle Ages, jewels, precious furs, livestock, household goods, or even specific rights like the right to collect tolls on a bridge or taxes from a certain village. Imagine listing your grandmother's heirloom teapot and your entire collection of action figures as part of your marriage portfolio. That's essentially what they were doing, just with more sheep and less plastic. The control of the dowry was usually a hot topic. While the husband typically gained control over the dowry property upon marriage, it wasn't always a free-for-all. Legal provisions were often put in place to ensure the wife's benefit, especially if she became a widow. The dowry might revert to her or her family if the marriage was childless or ended in annulment. This was her financial safety net, the medieval equivalent of an emergency fund, except it was paid for by her dad. But wait, there's more. While the bride's family was busy calculating the dowry, the groom's side was often making provisions for something called the dower or jointure. The dower was a portion of the husband's estate set aside specifically for his wife's support should she become a widow. It was her guaranteed income and property, distinct from her original dowry, and absolutely crucial for her economic survival in a society where women had limited independent means. A jointure, on the other hand, was property settled on the couple jointly, often with the specific understanding that it would pass to the wife for her use after the husband's death. These provisions were meticulously outlined in the marriage contract, a document that was far more important than any wedding vows. Speaking of that contract, it was the ultimate medieval prenup, but instead of protecting your cryptocurrency, it was protecting your cows, your castles, and your claim to that swampy bit of land down by the river. These were incredibly detailed legal documents, meticulously outlining all financial arrangements, responsibilities, and future contingencies. They covered everything from inheritances for future children, to the widow's provisions, to what would happen if the marriage somehow failed, though, as we've discussed, annulment was ridiculously difficult. Every potential loophole was considered, every possible dispute anticipated. It was a lawyer's dream come true, and probably a romantic's nightmare. Now for a slightly quirky tidbit that really highlights the transactional nature of these unions. Sometimes a dowry wasn't just about tangible assets. In some fascinating instances, a dowry might include something far less straightforward, like the right to collect specific feudal services, or a claim to a disputed piece of land, or even the assumption of a family debt. You could literally be marrying into a lawsuit. Imagine your in-laws saying, "And as part of the dowry, you get our ongoing legal battle with the guy who keeps letting his sheep graze on our disputed pasture." These kinds of arrangements made the marriage not just about consolidating existing wealth, but about solidifying or contesting territorial claims, resolving long-standing legal disputes, or even offloading financial burdens. It turned the bride into a walking, talking legal brief, which honestly sounds exhausting. And this brings us to an interesting point that historians still debate: the true extent to which a dowry actually empowered a medieval woman versus simply being a transactional requirement. On one hand, a large dowry clearly made a woman more desirable and could secure her a more advantageous match, giving her family significant leverage in negotiations. It also provided her with some level of security in widowhood. On the other hand, it placed immense pressure on her family to provide a substantial sum, and once married, control of the dowry often fell entirely to her husband, at least in practice if not always in law. Was it a form of leverage or just a very expensive ticket to ride the marriage train? The answer, like most things in history, is probably it's complicated. You can almost hear the scratch of the quill on the parchment, the low murmur of voices discussing percentages of land, the clink of a theoretical coin as a deal is struck. Every aspect of the wedding, from the feast to the attire, was part of this grand financial equation. Marriage was an economic engine, driving wealth transfer, consolidating power, and shaping the very fabric of medieval society. So, as you drift off, consider this. The next time you hear a fairy tale about a prince and princess falling in love and getting married, remember the vast network of shrewd negotiators, detailed contracts, and significant financial transactions that truly underpinned their happily ever after. Their union wasn't about a shared glance or a whispered promise. It was about a shared ledger and a promise of future prosperity. Sweet dreams, you transactional little history buff. You've learned by now that your modern, fluffy cloud, heart emoji version of medieval love is about as historically accurate as a dragon riding a unicycle. We've established that marriage was less about finding your soulmate and more about finding a suitable property line to merge with or a strategic alliance to forge. You've seen how heirs were paramount and women's choices were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly spoilt for options on Tinder. And courtly love? A delightful, poetic fantasy, like a medieval rom-com that nobody actually lived. But here's the thing about humans, darling listener. We're squishy, complicated creatures, full of inconvenient emotions. Even when every single societal pressure, economic necessity, and religious dictum screams, "No feelings allowed, just procreate and propagate," a funny little thing called affection can, sometimes, against all odds, quietly, almost secretively, bloom. It's like finding a tiny, resilient wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a castle wall, utterly unexpected, often overlooked, but undeniably there. Imagine, if you will, a young lady, perhaps barely out of childhood, being sent off to a cold, unfamiliar castle to marry a man she's never met. Her heart isn't fluttering with anticipation. It's likely thumping with a mixture of fear and duty. She arrives, perhaps he's older, gruff, preoccupied with his estates or his knights. There's no grand declaration of love, no candlelit dinners, certainly no awkward first dates that end with him ghosting her because her dowry wasn't quite what he expected. Honestly, imagine medieval dating apps. Swipe left if your family doesn't own at least 3 villages. The horror. Their initial interactions are probably formal, stiff, dictated by protocol and expectation. She learns her duties, he expects her to perform them. Yet day after day, week after week, they share a space. They eat at the same table, perhaps listening to the crackle of the hearth fire or the distant baying of hounds. They oversee the same household, manage the same servants, perhaps even discuss the mundane logistics of the harvest or the price of wool. He falls ill and she, despite everything, tends to him because it is her duty, yes, but also because he is her husband, the head of her household. She bears his children, enduring the terrifying, life-threatening ordeal of childbirth. And he, in turn, sees her strength, her resilience. They share the immense, silent grief of losing a child to the rampant illnesses of the age, a common tragedy that could either tear people apart or, sometimes, forge an unbreakable, if unspoken, bond. It's in these shared experiences, these quiet moments of mutual survival and responsibility, that something akin to affection could begin to take root. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love of a troubadour's song. Oh no, that would have been far too dramatic and inconvenient for medieval life. This was a quieter, more practical kind of affection, a mutual respect for competence, a quiet appreciation for companionship in a world that could be relentlessly harsh and lonely. He might come to rely on her sharp mind for managing the household accounts. She might appreciate his steadfastness in protecting their lands. It's the difference between a whirlwind romance and a comfortable, well-worn armchair. Less exciting, perhaps, but infinitely more dependable. Consider the wills, for instance. While many wills simply distributed property according to custom and law, occasionally you stumble upon a clause that hints at something more. A husband leaving a specific, cherished item to his wife, not just her dower lands, but a particular piece of jewelry, or a book, or a request for her to pray for his soul in a particularly personal way. Or a wife, in her own will, making provisions for her husband's comfort, even after her death, beyond what was legally required. These aren't grand love letters, mind you. They're the medieval equivalent of leaving a sticky note on the fridge saying, "Hey, I actually quite liked having you around." Subtle, but it's there. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this potential for quiet affection lies in the longevity of some medieval marriages, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. While life expectancy was low and remarriage was common due to death, many couples did indeed stay together for decades. For example, King Edward I of England and his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, were married for 36 years. While their union was undeniably a political alliance, their long years together and Edward's profound grief upon Eleanor's death, he erected memorial crosses, the Eleanor crosses, at each stopping place of her funeral procession. A truly immense and costly undertaking, suggest a deep personal bond that went far beyond mere duty. It wasn't the fiery, passionate courtly love, but a partnership that evolved into genuine affection and respect over decades of shared rule, shared children, and shared challenges. It's a bit like when you've been stuck on a long road trip with someone for days, and despite the initial awkwardness, you eventually bond over shared snacks and complaining about the traffic. Except, with more crusades and less air conditioning. Now, for a slightly quirkier tidbit that hints at personal bonds. You might find references in household accounts or even personal letters, rare as they are, to small, thoughtful gestures. A lord sending a specific, perhaps rare, fruit to his lady when she's traveling, or a lady embroidering a personal motif onto her husband's tunic, not for display, but for him alone. There are even instances of medieval couples sharing a bedchamber, not just for procreation, but for companionship, particularly as they aged. It sounds obvious to us, but given the often separate lives of medieval spouses, especially among the elite, sharing a private space simply for comfort and conversation was a quiet indicator of a bond that went beyond the transactional. Imagine the scandal if they had separate bedrooms. What, no shared chamber? Are they even trying to produce an heir? The neighbors will talk. Of course, we must be careful not to project our modern sensibilities too much onto these historical figures. What they considered affection or love might not align perfectly with our rom-com ideals. It could be a deep sense of loyalty, a shared history, or simply the comfort of familiarity. Historians still argue whether these instances represent true romantic love as we understand it, or simply a profound respect, companionship, and a strong sense of duty that, over time, matured into a deep fondness? Was it love, or just a really, really good working relationship? The debate rages on in dusty academic halls, probably fueled by lukewarm coffee and existential dread. Think about the sheer practicality of medieval life. Survival was a daily struggle. Managing an estate, running a household, raising children in an era of high mortality. These were enormous collaborative efforts. A husband and wife were, in essence, business partners in the most vital enterprise of their lives, the continuation of their lineage and their property. When two people work together, day in and day out, facing triumphs and tragedies, solving problems, and supporting each other through hardship, it's almost inevitable that some form of bond will develop. It might not be the fiery passion of 1,000 sonnets, but it could be the steady, comforting warmth of a well-stoked fire on a cold night. For instance, consider the merchant class. Their unions were often as strategic as those of the nobility, focused on wealth accumulation and business alliances. A merchant's wife was often an integral part of the family business, managing the shop while her husband was away, handling accounts, or even negotiating deals. When your financial well-being and future depend so heavily on the competence and reliability of your spouse, a deep mutual respect and partnership could easily blossom. You'd certainly want someone you could trust implicitly with your ledgers, right? It's hard to fall in love with someone who keeps fudging the numbers. Darling, I love you, but our balance sheet is a disaster. Even among the peasantry, where life was brutally hard and marriages were often arranged by parents or community elders based on land and labor needs, genuine affection could emerge. When you spend your entire life toiling in the fields alongside your spouse, sharing every hardship, every meager success, every aching muscle at the end of a long day, a profound camaraderie can develop. They might not have the luxury of grand romantic gestures, but the quiet act of sharing a meal, mending each other's clothes, or simply sitting together by a small fire after a day of backbreaking labor could be expressions of a deep, abiding connection. Their date night was probably just not starving to death. Talk about relationship goals. The Church, for all its strictures on marriage for procreation and order, also emphasized the concept of husband and wife becoming one flesh. While often interpreted in a purely physical and procreative sense, this doctrine also implicitly encouraged a certain unity and partnership within the marital bond. While not explicitly promoting romantic love, it laid the groundwork for a shared existence that could, for some, lead to deeper emotional ties. It's important to remember that these instances of true affection were often quiet, understated, and certainly not the dominant narrative. They were the exceptions, or perhaps the subtle undercurrents, in a sea of pragmatic unions. You wouldn't find them shouting their love from the castle battlements or writing passionate odes to each other, unless they were troubadours, and then it wasn't about their spouse anyway. Remember? Instead, you might see it in a shared glance, a familiar gesture, a comfortable silence, or the way one spouse instinctively knew what the other needed without a word. This quiet emergence of affection is a testament to the enduring human need for connection. Even when society dictates that love is irrelevant, or even dangerous, the human heart finds a way. It adapts, it compromises, it learns to find solace and companionship in the most unlikely of circumstances. It's a reminder that while the medieval world was vastly different from our own, the fundamental human desire for belonging, for partnership, and for some form of emotional intimacy persisted. It might have looked different, expressed itself differently, and certainly wasn't the starting point of most marriages. But it was there, a quiet, resilient flame in the pragmatic chill of medieval life. And that, my dear listener, is a truly fascinating, if often overlooked, aspect of the shocking truth about love in medieval times. As you drift further into the quiet currents of medieval history, leaving behind the grand pronouncements of the Church on matrimony, you might find yourself wondering, what if things went wrong? What if a marriage, for all its strategic planning and divine blessing, became truly unbearable? In our modern world, the idea of divorce, while often painful, is a recognized path. You seek legal counsel, you file papers, you navigate the complexities of separation. But in the medieval era, that concept, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Marriage, once entered into, was considered a sacrament, a holy, indissoluble bond forged by God Himself. You were in it for the long haul, often quite literally until death did you part, and sometimes, even then, the spiritual ties were considered to linger. So, if divorce was off the table, what was on the menu for those desperate for an out? The answer, whispered only in the hallowed, often echoing halls of ecclesiastical courts, was something called annulment. Now, don't confuse this with divorce. Annulment wasn't about ending a marriage. It was about declaring that a marriage had never actually been valid in the first place. It was like saying, "Oops, my bad. This sacred knot was tied with a faulty rope, so it never truly held." The Church, in its infinite wisdom and complex theological framework, held that certain impediments could render a marriage null and void from its very inception. But let me tell you, finding one of these faulty ropes was like searching for a needle in a hayloft. If the needle was invisible and the hayloft was guarded by a particularly stern, Latin-speaking dragon. You see, the Church was the ultimate arbiter of these matters, holding absolute sway over the spiritual and, by extension, the marital lives of everyone from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful king. Their grip on matrimony was ironclad, ensuring that marriage served its primary purpose: procreation and the maintenance of societal order, not, as we've discussed, personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. So, if you found yourself in a truly dire situation, your only recourse was to appeal to these ecclesiastical courts, hoping to convince them that your union was, in the eyes of God and canon law, a complete sham from day one. What kind of faulty ropes could you possibly claim? Well, the grounds for annulment were incredibly narrow and specific. One of the most common and often strategically abused was consanguinity or affinity. This meant you were too closely related by blood, consanguinity, or by marriage, affinity, to your spouse. The Church's definition of too close was astonishingly broad, extending to 7 degrees of kinship. That's quite a family tree you'd need to trace. You could be related through a shared great-great-great-great-grandparent, or even through a previous marriage of a family member. Imagine trying to navigate that family reunion, let alone trying to prove it in court. It was a labyrinthine puzzle that often required genealogists, or at least, people very good at making up genealogies, to find some obscure, distant cousin who had once married your spouse's great-aunt's second cousin twice removed. It's almost like they were trying to make it hard on purpose. Isn't it? Oh, you want out? Well, first, prove your great-great-great-great-grandma once shared a particularly awkward holiday dinner with his great-great-great-great-uncle. Another ground was a pre-contract, meaning one of the parties had already made a binding promise to marry someone else before the current union. This was surprisingly common in an era where betrothals could be made years in advance, sometimes even in childhood, and were often considered as legally binding as the marriage itself. If proof emerged of such a prior agreement, it could render the subsequent marriage invalid. Then there was the issue of lack of free consent. If you could prove you were forced into the marriage against your will, perhaps under duress or threat, then the sacrament wasn't truly entered into freely, and thus it wasn't valid. This was a particularly difficult one to prove, especially for women, who often had little say in their marital arrangements to begin with. You can practically hear the judge sighing, "Oh, so you didn't want to marry that grumpy old baron? And you're only telling us now." Perhaps the most humiliating and difficult ground to prove was non-consummation or impotence. This meant the marriage had never been physically completed, or one of the spouses was permanently unable to perform the marital act. This wasn't just about a bad night. It had to be a persistent inability, and proving it? Well, let's just say it involved a level of invasive scrutiny that would make even modern reality TV producers blush. Ecclesiastical courts would sometimes appoint matrons, usually older, respected women, to physically examine the couple, particularly the wife, to determine if the marriage had been consummated. Imagine the awkward silence in that medieval examining room. It's certainly a quirky tidbit from history, a stark reminder of how public and personal these private matters could become when the Church stepped in. So you had a potential ground. Great. Now came the process, and this is where the near impossibility truly hit home. You didn't just pop down to the local vicarage for a chat. You initiated a formal legal proceeding in an ecclesiastical court, which was often far away, expensive, and incredibly slow. You had to present your case, often through legal representatives, if you could afford them, and provide witnesses to corroborate your claims. This meant bringing in family members, servants, neighbors, anyone who might have knowledge of your distant ancestry, your unwilling consent, or, God forbid, the intimate details of your marital bed. The process could drag on for years, sometimes even decades. Think about that for a moment. You are stuck in a marriage you believe to be invalid, possibly living apart from your spouse, but unable to move on, unable to remarry, your life in a perpetual state of limbo, all while navigating a bureaucratic nightmare of medieval proportions. Documents would be drawn up in Latin, testimonies recorded, and appeals made to higher church authorities, sometimes even all the way to Rome itself. The cost was astronomical, effectively putting annulment out of reach for most commoners, who simply couldn't afford the legal fees, travel, and time away from their livelihoods. Even for the wealthy and powerful, it was a draining ordeal. You might have heard whispers of King Henry VIII's struggles to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. While a bit later than our core medieval period, his epic, decade-long battle perfectly illustrates the immense power of the church and the near impossibility of dissolving a marriage, even for a monarch. He literally had to break with the Pope to get his way. And what were the consequences if you did manage to secure that elusive annulment? They were profound and often devastating. If a marriage was declared null from the beginning, it meant that any children born of that union were instantly rendered illegitimate. In a society where legitimacy was paramount for inheritance, social standing, and even basic rights, this was a catastrophic blow. Your children, through no fault of their own, could be stripped of their claims to property, titles, and even their good name. Property that had been exchanged as part of the marriage settlement would also become a tangled mess, leading to further legal disputes and financial ruin. Socially, even a successful annulment carried a stigma. You had been involved in a union that was, by the church's decree, never valid, which could cast a shadow over your reputation and future prospects, particularly for women. So, when the outline mentions dire circumstances, it's important to understand what that truly meant in the medieval context. It didn't mean you were unhappy, or that you fell out of love, or that your spouse was a terrible conversationalist. Those were simply the trials of life that God had bestowed upon you. Dire circumstances referred to fundamental, canonical impediments that, from the Church's perspective, prevented the sacrament from ever being truly formed. It was about upholding the integrity of the institution of marriage, not about offering individuals an escape hatch from a bad situation. Historians still argue whether the wealthy truly had an easier time securing annulments than commoners, or if the process was equally arduous for all. While the rich certainly had the funds to navigate the labyrinthine legal system and hire the best advocates, the fundamental strictures of canon law applied to everyone. The Church, in theory, treated all souls equally before God, but the practical realities of medieval legal proceedings often favored those with deeper pockets and more influence. You can imagine a poor peasant trying to prove consanguinity when their family records barely went back a generation, let alone 7. Ultimately, the immense difficulty of dissolving a medieval marriage, even in what we might consider dire circumstances, underscores the era's profoundly different understanding of love, commitment, and individual agency. Marriage was a permanent, divinely sanctioned contract, a cornerstone of society, and the idea of personal fulfillment within it was a distant, almost alien concept. Your options for escape were few, the path fraught with peril, and the consequences often more ruinous than the marriage itself. You were, for all intents and purposes, locked in. And as you settled deeper into your pillow, you might just feel a tiny bit grateful for modern divorce laws, even with all their complexities. You've journeyed with us through the grand halls of castles, glimpsed the intricate dance of courtly love, and felt the chill wind whip through the tapestries of noble ambition. You've seen how love, for the medieval elite, was often less a fluttering heart and more a carefully calculated chess move on the grand board of power and lineage. But now, as the embers glow a little softer in our storytelling hearth, let's leave the polished stone and silken gowns behind. Let's step outside the castle walls, past the manicured gardens, and trudge with me into the muddy, bustling, often brutal reality of the medieval village. This is where the vast majority of people lived, worked, and, yes, even loved. And you'll find that peasant love, oh, it was a different beast entirely. Imagine, if you will, the scent of wood smoke mingling with damp earth, the distant bleating of sheep, and the constant murmur of human toil. You're no longer worried about a dowry of vast estates or political alliances with distant dukes. No, your concerns are far more immediate, far more visceral. You're thinking about the next harvest, the health of your meager livestock, and whether the winter will be harsh enough to starve you out. For the medieval peasant, marriage wasn't about merging dynasties. It was about merging muscle. It was about finding a partner whose hands were as calloused as yours, whose back was as strong, and who possessed the sheer, stubborn will to survive. Your parents, if they were still around and able, would still have a significant say in your choice of partner, much like the nobility. But the criteria were vastly different. It wasn't about who could bring the most land or the most prestigious name to the union. It was about who could bring the most work. Could she spin enough wool to clothe the family? Could he plow a straight furrow? Could they both endure the backbreaking labor from sunup to sundown, day after day, year after year? Your dowry wasn't a chest of jewels. It might be a goat, a few chickens, or perhaps, if you were truly lucky, a small plot of land or some tools. It was less like a fancy wedding registry and more like a very practical, very dusty farm equipment exchange. Oh, darling, look, Aunt Mildred got us a new hoe. It's exactly what we needed. The concept of courtship, as depicted in the chivalric romances, was utterly alien here. There were no serenades beneath moonlit windows, no whispered poems of undying devotion. Your date night might involve mucking out the pigsty together, or perhaps a shared ale by the communal fire after a long day in the fields, too exhausted for anything more than a grunt of acknowledgement. Life was raw, exposed, and intensely communal. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Your village was your entire world, and privacy was a luxury simply not afforded to those whose lives depended on collective effort and shared struggle. It was like living in a reality TV show, but with significantly more manure and far less glamour. You couldn't escape the watchful eyes of your neighbors, who were often also your relatives, your landlords, and your entire social circle. Children, for the peasant family, were not merely heirs to a title. They were essential labor. From a very young age, you'd see them contributing to the household economy, whether it was scaring birds from the crops, fetching water, or helping with the never-ending task of mending and cleaning. The more hands, the better. This practical necessity shaped not only the decision to marry but also the very fabric of the marital relationship. A good marriage meant a productive household, and a productive household meant survival. The emotional bonds, while undoubtedly present in many cases, often had to grow within this incredibly demanding framework, rather than being the primary driver of the union itself. The church, of course, still held sway, defining marriage as a sacrament for procreation and upholding the sanctity of the marital bond. For peasants, this meant that while their unions might have been less about romantic love, they were still bound by religious strictures. Divorce was still virtually impossible, and annulment was an unheard-of luxury for the common folk. You were in it for the long haul, for better or for worse, until death did you part, and death, sadly, often came sooner rather than later for those living such arduous lives. The average life expectancy for a medieval peasant was significantly lower than for the nobility, often hovering around 30 to 40 years, making every relationship, every union, a fleeting and precious thing, even if born of necessity. This mainstream historical fact underscores the practical urgency behind many peasant unions. Despite the hardships, there's a fascinating, almost stubborn resilience in peasant relationships. While nobles might have had arranged marriages for political gain, some historians suggest that peasants, paradoxically, might have had more practical freedom in choosing a partner within their immediate social circle once parental approval was secured, simply because the stakes were lower in terms of grand dynastic power. It wasn't about who your family was, but about what your family did. This isn't to say it was a free-for-all. Far from it. But the focus shifted from abstract titles to concrete skills. A quirky tidbit you might find is the practice of hand fasting in some regions. a temporary or trial marriage that was common among lower classes before the church fully stamped out such customs in favor of indissoluble, lifelong unions. It was a pragmatic way to test compatibility before committing to a bond that couldn't be broken. The challenges were immense. Famine, disease, war, these were constant threats that could shatter a family unit in an instant. Shared grief, shared struggle, and shared triumphs, like a good harvest. Forged bonds that might have been less about passionate romance and more about a deep, abiding partnership. You were a team, a small, self-sufficient unit against the vast indifference of the medieval world. Your love, if it blossomed, was likely a quiet, sturdy thing, built on mutual respect, shared labor, and the simple understanding that you were each other's best chance at survival. Historians still argue whether peasant couples, despite the hardships, might have experienced a deeper, more resilient form of affection born out of shared struggle, or if their unions were almost entirely transactional. Was it possible for genuine love, as we understand it, to flourish amidst such relentless toil? Or was love simply a convenient label for the necessary alliance of two individuals working to keep a household afloat? There are no diaries or love letters from the peasantry to tell us their stories directly. Only the faint echoes found in legal documents, church records, and the occasional folk song. We have to infer, to imagine, to piece together their emotional lives from the scant evidence they left behind. So, while the noblewoman might pine for her courtly knight from afar, the peasant woman likely hoped for a husband who didn't drink away all their meager earnings and who was strong enough to help with the plowing. And the peasant man? He probably sought a wife who was industrious, fertile, and could manage the household with an iron will and a thrifty hand. Their dreams were not of grand gestures, but of full bellies, healthy children, and a roof that didn't leak too badly. Their happily ever after was simply, we survived another year. It's a stark, humbling reminder that love, in its essence, adapts to its environment, taking on the color and texture of the lives it inhabits. For the medieval peasant, love was less a soaring eagle and more a sturdy, hard-working ox, pulling the plow of life, side by side, through mud and sun, come what may. After all that talk of dowries and dynastic ambitions, of strategic alliances forged in cold stone castles, and of love as a mere literary flourish, you might be forgiven for thinking medieval hearts were made of stone, or perhaps just very practical, well-oiled gears. You've seen how marriage was a business, how children were assets, and how even the most passionate courtly poems were often about anything but actual, attainable romance. Paints a rather bleak picture, doesn't it? A world where emotional connection seems to have been carefully cataloged, regulated, or simply ignored. But here's the fascinating, undeniably human truth. Despite every single constraint, every societal expectation, every harsh reality that tried to box it in, the fundamental human need for connection, for affection, for love in its myriad forms, persisted. It pulsed quietly beneath the surface, finding unexpected cracks to bloom through, like a persistent wildflower pushing through cobblestones. Imagine, if you will, the sheer tenacity of the human heart. You've just been married off, perhaps at an age when you're still figuring out which end of a spoon to use, to someone you've met perhaps once or twice. There's no flutter of butterflies, no grand declaration of undying passion. It's a contract, a duty. But then, day after day, year after year, you share meals across the same heavy wooden table. You navigate the chaotic household together, manage the estate, survive bouts of plague that sweep through the village, and perhaps, God willing, welcome children into the world. You become partners in the truest sense. And sometimes, in the quiet moments after the servants have retired, or during a shared vigil over a sick child, a subtle, sturdy affection begins to grow. It's not the explosive, dramatic love of Hollywood, but a deep, quiet companionship born of shared experience, mutual respect, and the sheer fact of enduring life's immense challenges side by side. You might find comfort in the familiar scent of their presence by the hearth on a cold winter's night, or a reassuring hand on your arm when news of a distant war reaches your ears. It's a slow-burn romance, less about fireworks and more about the steady, comforting glow of embers. This slow blossoming of affection within arranged marriages is a mainstream historical fact, often evidenced not by love letters. Those were rare and usually for courtly affairs, not spouses, but by more mundane documents. You might stumble upon a will where a husband leaves specific, cherished items to his wife, not merely out of legal obligation, but with explicit mention of love and goodwill, or a widow requesting to be buried directly beside her departed husband, a tangible desire for continued closeness even in death. These small gestures, these quiet declarations embedded in legalistic prose, speak volumes about the genuine emotional bonds that could form. It's a bit like finding a hidden message in a tax return, unexpected, but deeply meaningful. And what about the most primal, fierce love of all, parental love? We've touched on the harsh realities of childhood, the high infant mortality rates that would make any modern parent gasp. But don't ever mistake the frequent loss for a lack of profound love. When you held that tiny, swaddled bundle, felt the warmth of their breath against your cheek, watched them take their first wobbly steps across the rushes on the floor, you poured your hopes and dreams into them. The pain of loss, when it inevitably struck many families, was profoundly felt. Grief was not suppressed. It was an open, visceral wound. You would see laments written, sometimes carved into stone, for lost children. A quirky tidbit you might not expect is the sheer number of medieval lullabies that have survived, many of them incredibly tender, some even invoking saints for protection, showing the deep, anxious love parents held. One such lullaby, from the 14th century, speaks of a mother rocking her child, pleading with God to keep him safe from harm, a testament to the universal desire to protect one's offspring, even when the odds were stacked against them. It's a feeling that transcends centuries, a love that makes you want to wrap your child in bubble wrap, even if bubble wrap hadn't been invented yet. Beyond the confines of the marital bed and the family hearth, where did people find deep emotional connection? Often, it was in the warm embrace of friendship. In a world where kin ties were paramount for survival and social standing, friendships provided an alternative, often equally powerful, source of emotional sustenance. You might have a sworn brother or sworn sister with whom you'd share secrets, sorrows, and even your last hunk of moldy bread. These were not casual acquaintances. These were bonds forged in shared hardship, loyalty, and mutual support, often deeper than many purely familial ties. Think of the legendary friendships between knights, like Roland and Oliver, or the deep camaraderie within a monastic order. These were relationships built on trust and devotion, where you knew someone truly had your back. It was like the original BFF necklace, but with more swords and less glitter. For many, perhaps the most profound love was directed upwards, towards the divine. The intense love for God, for the Virgin Mary, for the pantheon of saints, wasn't just abstract theology. It was a deeply personal, often ecstatic, emotional experience. You might spend hours in quiet contemplation, feeling a connection that transcended earthly concerns, a love that promised eternity and a solace that no human relationship could fully provide. Mystics, in particular, describe their relationship with God in language often indistinguishable from earthly passion, hinting at the powerful emotional outlet spiritual devotion offered. Pilgrimages, acts of extreme penance, or monastic vows were all expressions of this profound spiritual love. Historians still argue whether the intense spiritual devotion of the period served primarily as an emotional outlet for people whose earthly relationships were so constrained, or if it was simply a natural expression of a deeply religious society. Perhaps it was both, a beautiful intertwining of human need and divine promise. And then there are the quieter, often overlooked, affections. The bond with a loyal hunting dog, a sturdy workhorse, or even a beloved falcon was very real. You spent countless hours training, caring for, and relying on these creatures. They weren't just tools. They were companions, often offering unconditional affection in a world that could be very conditional indeed. You'd feel the warmth of a cat curled on your lap by the fire, a small purring comfort in a world full of hard edges and demanding duties. Even the relationship between a shepherd and his flock, or a farmer and his land, could hold an element of deep, protective care, a connection born of sustained effort and reliance. These were not romantic loves, but they were expressions of care, responsibility, and attachment that speak to a fundamental human need to nurture and connect. Consider also the broader expressions of care and loyalty that permeated medieval society. Think of a knight's unwavering loyalty to his lord, a vassal's dedication, or a long-standing servant's devotion to a noble household. These weren't love in the modern romantic sense, but they were expressions of deep care, trust, and connection that formed the very fabric of society. Fealty wasn't just a legal contract. It was an emotional bond, often cemented by shared history and mutual dependence. It was less, "Will you accept this rose?" and more, "Will you accept this lifetime of unwavering fealty and occasional pest control?" These were relationships built on a different kind of affection, one of steadfastness and shared purpose. And perhaps the most undeniable evidence of deep affection, cutting through all the practicalities and societal norms, is found in loss. The elaborate mourning rituals, the heartfelt laments, the desire for memorialization. You don't grieve so profoundly for something you never truly cared for. Medieval gravestones and effigies often depict couples holding hands or children nestled beside their parents, a poignant testament to enduring bonds that even death could not fully sever. The sheer weight of sorrow expressed in medieval poetry and chronicles, whether for a lost spouse, child, or friend, reminds us that the capacity for attachment and the pain of its severance were as real then as they are today. Even for the peasant, whose life was a ceaseless cycle of toil, hardship, and survival, the human need for connection persisted. While their unions were practical necessities for labor and survival, there were shared smiles across a muddy field, a comforting hand on a weary shoulder after a long day of plowing, the quiet understanding of a shared burden. They too mourned their dead, celebrated their births, and found solace in the warmth of a shared bed, even if it was just a straw pallet. Love, in its most fundamental form, is about connection, about belonging, about finding another soul to navigate the world with. And that need, that deep human yearning, is universal. You can't outlaw cuddling, even if you try really, really hard. So, while the medieval world wasn't a rom-com filled with grand gestures and passionate declarations, it was undeniably human. And where there are humans, there is a fundamental, irrepressible need to connect, to care, to belong, and yes, in myriad forms, to love. It just looked a little different under those pointy hats and heavy cloaks, often manifesting as a quiet, resilient flame rather than a roaring inferno. It was a love that found its way through the cracks of a rigid society, proving that the human heart, no matter the era, always finds a way to beat with affection. And so, as the moon begins its slow climb outside your window, casting long, sleepy shadows across your room, we arrive at the very end of our journey through the shocking truths of medieval love. You've trudged through the muck of practicality, the thorny bushes of societal expectation, and the shimmering, often deceptive, mirage of courtly ideals. Now, as you snuggle deeper into your covers, let's pull back the final curtain and consider something truly fascinating. How these ancient, seemingly alien realities still echo, sometimes subtly, sometimes loudly, in our very modern understanding of romance. You see, the medieval period, with all its pragmatic marriages and rigid social structures, didn't just vanish into the mists of history. It left behind a peculiar, often contradictory, legacy that continues to shape our contemporary understanding of love, marriage, and even heartbreak. It's like finding a medieval gargoyle on a modern skyscraper, a strange, intriguing anachronism that makes you tilt your head and wonder. Consider, for instance, the enduring power of the romantic myth. Despite everything we've uncovered about courtly love being a literary game, an elite fantasy played out in poetry and song, its core tenets still resonate. You still hear whispers of the knight in shining armor, rescuing the damsel in distress. Don't you? This isn't just a trope from Disney movies. It's a direct descendant of the troubadour's idealized lover, pure and noble, performing impossible feats for an unattainable lady. We might scoff at the idea of a literal knight, but the underlying yearning for a grand, sweeping gesture, for someone to fight dragons, even metaphorical ones like your student loan debt, for your affection is deeply ingrained. It's as if, somewhere deep in our collective subconscious, we still expect love to arrive on a white horse, even if that horse is now a slightly dented Tesla. This romantic ideal, born from the very constraints of medieval life, where real marriages were so unromantic, people needed an escape, created a powerful counter-narrative. It set the stage for the later evolution of marriage from a purely economic and political contract to something ideally based on affection and choice. You see, the very lack of love in medieval marriages ironically fueled the desire for it. It was like living in a world without dessert, and suddenly everyone started dreaming of cake. This mainstream historical fact, the gradual shift from arranged marriages to love matches, is one of the most significant social transformations, and it arguably gained momentum from the medieval period's stark contrast between reality and ideal. But it's not just the romantic ideals that linger. The shadows of medieval practicality also stretch into our modern relationships. While you might scoff at the idea of a dowry today, and thank goodness you can, the underlying economic considerations haven't entirely vanished. We talk about financial compatibility, shared life goals, and building a future together. These are softer terms, certainly less about transferring sheep and land, but they still acknowledge that relationships operate within a material reality. You're not marrying for your family's land, perhaps, but you're probably not marrying someone who actively drains your bank account either. It's a much more subtle negotiation, but the echoes of medieval pragmatism, the idea that a union needs to be sensible in some way, are definitely still there. And what about the Church's grip on matrimony? While many modern societies have embraced secular marriage and divorce is far more accessible, the historical weight of marriage as a sacred, indissoluble bond, primarily for procreation, still influences many cultures and religious communities. The emphasis on fidelity, the moral condemnation of adultery, these are not just modern constructs. They are deeply rooted in centuries of ecclesiastical law and societal norms that began to solidify in the medieval period. You might not face a public shaming and banishment for a transgression today, but the emotional and social fallout often carries a similar weight, a testament to how deeply these historical values are embedded. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on marriage as a sacrament truly elevated its status or merely tightened its control over individuals' lives. But either way, its impact is undeniable. Let's not forget the quirkier tidbits that surprisingly don't quite make it to the modern era, yet their absence highlights our shift. For instance, while medieval people sometimes consulted astrologers for propitious wedding dates, or even brewed rudimentary love potions, more likely to cause a stomachache than true love, let's be honest. You're unlikely to find a modern dating app suggesting you align your chakras with your potential partner's planetary positions before your first coffee date. Or imagine a medieval custom where a suitor would serenade his beloved under her window with a lute. Cute, right? Now imagine trying that today. You'd probably get a noise complaint from the neighbors or worse, mistaken for a very confused delivery driver. These are the small, almost imperceptible shifts that highlight how far we've come from the earnest, often superstitious, attempts at finding love in a world that offered so few real choices. The very concept of the soulmate, that one perfect person destined for you, is also a fascinating legacy. In a world where marriages were arranged and often loveless, the idea of a truly complementary spirit, a kindred soul, would have been a radical, almost subversive thought. It's as if the human heart, denied true romantic fulfillment for centuries, exploded into this grand, almost spiritual quest for the one. We're still searching for that elusive connection, that perfect fit, a testament to the enduring human need for deep, personal affection that the medieval system largely suppressed. Even our modern anxieties about relationships can be traced back. The pressure to find the one, the fear of being alone, the complexities of navigating expectations, these are universal, but their particular flavor is seasoned by history. We crave emotional intimacy, perhaps because for so long it was a luxury, a rare gem to be found within the confines of a practical union, if at all. We value communication, because medieval relationships, often based on duty and hierarchy, left little room for genuine dialogue or emotional expression. It's like we're trying to overcompensate for centuries of emotional repression. Think about it. The medieval period, with its strict gender roles, its emphasis on lineage over individual happiness, its very public shaming for deviation, inadvertently created the very fertile ground for the explosion of romanticism that followed. It was a pressure cooker that, when finally released, gave us the grand narratives of passion, the belief in love conquering all, and the expectation that marriage should be the culmination of a deep emotional bond. So, as you drift off, consider this. When you watch a historical romance film or read a novel about star-crossed lovers, you're not just consuming entertainment. You're participating in a centuries-long dialogue about love, a conversation that began in the shadowy castles and humble villages of the Middle Ages. The tension between practicality and passion, duty and desire, societal expectation and individual yearning, these are not new struggles. They are echoes, sometimes faint, sometimes resonant, of a world that, despite its vast differences, laid some of the foundational stones for how you, today, understand and experience the most profound and perplexing of human emotions. The shocking truth is that medieval love, in all its stark reality and idealized fantasy, is still very much a part of your modern heart. The air around you is growing soft, like a gentle silken curtain slowly descending. The thoughts of knights and troubadours, of dowries and whispered affections, begin to swirl and blend, losing their sharp edges, becoming part of the quiet hum of the night. You've journeyed so far tonight, through centuries and across continents of human experience. And now, as the last vestiges of the day fade, you can feel your own mind softening, preparing for rest. Let the images of the past gently recede, like ripples on a calm pond, leaving behind only a sense of wonder and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the quiet comforts of your own time. There's no more need to strive or to understand, simply to be. The world outside is peaceful, and inside, your thoughts are becoming feathery light, ready to drift into the silent, comforting embrace of sleep. Allow yourself to sink deeper, to feel the warmth of your bed, the gentle rhythm of your breath. All is well and all the stories have been told. Just peace now and the soft, welcoming darkness.